Get your hands where I can see them, or I will put you on the ground. The porch light caught the officer's knuckles, white, clenched, wrapped around the grip of a service weapon still holstered but unsnapped. Behind him, a second cruiser's headlights carved the front yard into harsh geometry. The man on the porch hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't done anything except stand on his own property holding a cup of coffee that was still warm. 8 seconds later, the coffee was on the concrete and the man was face down on the porch boards with a knee between his shoulder blades. The officer's body cam recorded everything. So did a device the officer didn't know about, a Ring doorbell camera hardwired to a server that would make this footage very difficult to erase. The officer had picked the wrong porch, the wrong man, and in about 14 hours, the wrong porch was going to become the most consequential piece of real estate in Durham County. 3 weeks earlier, a gray Ford Taurus pulled into the driveway of 4712 Birchwood Lane in Colton Ridge, a planned subdivision 8 miles northwest of Durham, North Carolina. The kind of neighborhood where every third house shared the same floor plan. The lawns were measured by HOA rulers, and the recycling bins had to face a specific direction on collection day. 92 homes, 87 of them occupied by white families. The other 5 were mixed or Asian. None were black. Until now. Terrance Calloway stepped out of the Taurus, stretched his back, and surveyed the rental property he'd be calling home. Single story, beige siding, small front porch with a swing that needed oiling. The yard was trimmed but lifeless. The previous tenant had left 3 months ago, and nobody had bothered planting anything since. He popped the trunk. 2 suitcases, a box of kitchen supplies, a locked briefcase with a federal property tag he tucked under the passenger seat before carrying anything inside. That briefcase would stay in the car unless he needed it, and he hoped he wouldn't need it. The whole point was to not need it. Inside, the house smelled like carpet cleaner and vacancy. He checked every room before bringing in the rest. Bathroom, both bedrooms, the hall closet, the attached garage. Checked the back door lock, checked the windows. Pulled each curtain closed 2 inches from center, leaving a gap just wide enough to observe the street without being obvious about it. He lined his shoes by the front door, heels flush against the baseboard, toes pointing out at 45 degrees, a habit so ingrained he didn't notice he was doing it anymore. If this story already has you hooked, make sure you subscribe, because what happens next is something you won't see coming. The first knock came 40 minutes after he'd finished unloading. He opened the door to a woman in her early 50s, highlighted hair pulled tight, holding a clipboard and a foil-wrapped plate that smelled like banana bread. She wore a polo shirt with the Colton Ridge Homeowners Association logo embroidered above the pocket. Her smile was wide. Her eyes were doing math. "Welcome to the neighborhood. I'm Diana Prescott. I'm the HOA president. We like to greet all our new residents personally." She extended the plate. "Banana bread, my grandmother's recipe." "Thank you." Terrance accepted the plate. "Terrance Calloway. I appreciate the welcome." Calloway. She repeated the name like she was filing it. "And what brings you to Colton Ridge, Mr. Calloway?" "IT consulting. Remote work, mostly. Looking for somewhere quiet." "You'll find plenty of quiet here. We're very proud of our community standards." She glanced past his shoulder into the house. Quick, practiced, the kind of scan that cataloged everything visible in 2 seconds. Boxes, minimal furniture, no family photos on the walls, a man alone with almost no belongings. "Are you renting the Kimball property?" 6-month lease, through the management company. "Henderson Realty. Yes, we've had some concerns about their tenant screening process." The smile hadn't changed, but the words carried weight. "Nothing personal, of course. It's just that the Kimball house has been vacant for a while, and we want to make sure our community standards are maintained." Terrance held the plate steady, kept his expression neutral. "I keep a clean yard and quiet hours," he said. "You won't have any complaints from me." "I'm sure." Diana's eyes moved to the Taurus in the driveway. Older model. Some rust around the wheel wells. Not the kind of car that typically parked in Colton Ridge driveways, where Suburbans and BMWs dominated the landscape. Well, if you need anything, my number's on the welcome packet Henderson should have left inside. Board meetings are the second Thursday of every month at the community center. She turned and walked back down the path, her sandals clicking on the concrete. At the sidewalk, she paused and looked back. Oh, one more thing. We have a neighborhood watch program, very active. If you see anything unusual, don't hesitate to call. And if you're going to be outside late at night, some of the residents get a little nervous about unfamiliar activity after dark. Another smile. Just so you know. She was gone before he could respond. Terrance closed the door, set the banana bread on the kitchen counter, stood in the hallway for a moment, processing the interaction the way he'd been trained to process interactions, cataloging language, noting subtext, filing away the specific phrases that revealed more than the speaker intended. Tenant screening concerns, community standards, nervous about unfamiliar activity after dark. He'd been in the house less than an hour. The welcome committee had already conducted a preliminary assessment and found him lacking, not because of anything he'd done, because of everything he was. He unpacked methodically. Clothes in the bedroom closet, plain, unremarkable. The wardrobe of a man who didn't want to be noticed. Laptop on the kitchen table, positioned so the screen wasn't visible from any window. 2 phones, one personal, one prepaid, both placed in the same drawer beside the refrigerator. The personal phone stayed off unless he needed it for cover purposes. The prepaid was his real line, encrypted, routing through a server in Raleigh that scrambled metadata 6 ways before anything reached a cell tower. He installed the Ring doorbell camera himself that evening. Small, black, positioned at an angle that captured the full porch and most of the walkway to the street. The footage didn't store locally. It uploaded in real time to an encrypted cloud server registered to a shell company called Tidewater Digital Solutions, LLC, an entity that existed on paper and nowhere else, created specifically for operations like this one. The neighbors noticed the camera. He intended them to. Let them think he was security conscious. Let them assume a single black man in a neighborhood like this had reason to be cautious. Both assumptions were correct. Neither touched the real reason the camera was there. By the end of the first week, Terrance had mapped the neighborhood's social architecture with the same precision he'd once mapped insurgent networks in classified briefings. Diana Prescott sat at the top, HOA president for 6 consecutive terms, Facebook group administrator, the person who decided which complaints became official and which disappeared. Her husband, Gerald, was a retired insurance adjuster who played golf 3 times a week and contributed nothing to the HOA's operations except silent agreement. Below Diana, the hierarchy organized itself around proximity to her approval. The Warrens at 4708 mowed on her schedule. The Petersons at 4720 reported packages left on doorsteps for more than 4 hours. Mrs. Cho at 4716 had been warned twice about the color of her mailbox. And at the bottom, or rather, outside the hierarchy entirely, was Terrance, the new tenant, the black man in the beige house with the old car and no visible employment that required him to leave at regular hours. He kept his routine deliberately boring. Coffee on the porch at 7 a.m., a run through the neighborhood at 6 p.m., always the same route, always waving at anyone who looked his way, always wearing earbuds so people could assume he wasn't listening. Groceries on Wednesdays, trash out on Fridays. The rhythms of a man with nothing to hide. On day 4, he found a note in his mailbox, unsigned, printed on plain white paper. Reminder: all exterior modifications require HOA board approval prior to installation. This includes security cameras, satellite dishes, and decorative fixtures. Please submit Form 7-B at your earliest convenience. Colton Ridge, HOA. He read the note twice, folded it, placed it in the kitchen drawer beside the prepaid phone. Not because he needed to keep it, but because documenting everything was the kind of habit that stayed with you long after the reason you'd developed it had faded into muscle memory. The camera stayed. He did not submit Form 7-B. On day 9, someone egged his car. He discovered it at 6:14 a.m. when he stepped onto the porch for his morning coffee. 3 eggs, dried overnight, the albumin already baked into the paint by Carolina humidity. No witnesses. No security footage from any neighboring house. He checked his own camera, which showed a figure in dark clothing approaching from the blind spot at 2:27 a.m., moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly which angle to avoid, someone who knew where cameras were, someone who'd studied the street. Terrance cleaned the car without mentioning it to anyone, filed the footage, added it to a growing file that included Diana's welcome committee visit, the unsigned note, and 3 separate occasions when neighbors had crossed the street to avoid walking past him on the sidewalk. 14 days in, and the pattern was textbook. He'd seen it in case files 100 times, the slow escalation playbook that communities use to pressure unwanted residents into leaving. Minor vandalism, passive-aggressive communications, social isolation. The unspoken agreement that discomfort should be managed not by addressing the people causing it, but by removing the person they found uncomfortable. What the neighborhood didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that Terrance Calloway's presence in Colton Ridge had nothing to do with IT consulting and everything to do with a 14-month federal investigation that had already produced 200 pages of documentation, 16 cooperating witnesses, and a pattern or practice file thick enough to trigger a Department of Justice civil rights review. The Durham County Sheriff's Office was dirty. Not every deputy, not every shift, but enough of them, in enough positions, with enough institutional protection, that the corruption had calcified into something structural. Excessive force complaints buried by internal affairs. Evidence room discrepancies that nobody questioned. A network of deputies who ran traffic stops like shakedowns, targeting Black and Latino motorists on routes between Durham and Chapel Hill, confiscating cash under civil asset forfeiture statutes and splitting the proceeds through a system so well organized it had its own accounting. Terrance's job was to build the case from the inside. Not undercover in the traditional sense. He wasn't posing as a deputy or infiltrating the department directly. He was establishing a presence in a jurisdiction where the corruption operated, creating a documented pattern of his own treatment that would become Exhibit A when the federal case went to trial. Every interaction with local law enforcement was potential evidence. Every encounter was being recorded, cataloged, and transmitted to the Raleigh field office in real time. He was bait. Professional, voluntary, carefully calculated bait. And he was getting very close to a bite. The dead drop was scheduled for Thursday night. His contact inside the sheriff's office, a patrol officer named Janelle Morse, 26, 3 years on the force, recruited by the Bureau after she'd filed an internal complaint about evidence tampering that her supervisors had shredded, was supposed to deliver a USB drive containing 6 months of internal communications, emails between deputies, shift scheduling logs that showed which officers were consistently paired for the most lucrative forfeiture stops. And, if Morse had managed to access the terminal she'd described, the internal affairs database that tracked complaints, not the sanitized version released to the public under FOIA requests, but the raw files that showed how complaints were reclassified, witnesses discouraged, and investigations closed before they'd begun. The plan was simple. Morse would drive past 4712 Birchwood Lane at 10:15 p.m. on her way home from shift. She'd slow at the mailbox, drop the USB into the newspaper slot, a 3-second maneuver that looked like nothing if anyone happened to be watching. Terrance would retrieve it from the porch after midnight. By morning, the contents would be on a secure server in Raleigh, and the case against the Durham County Sheriff's Office would move from preliminary to actionable. Thursday arrived overcast and warm. Terrance spent the day maintaining his cover, answering emails from fictional clients, running diagnostic scripts on a laptop that contained nothing classified, making a grocery run to the Harris Teeter on Garrett Road. Normal behavior, boring behavior. The kind of day that wouldn't stand out to anyone watching. By 9 p.m., the neighborhood had settled into its nightly quiet. Porch lights on, living room windows flickering with television glow, the occasional dog walker making a final loop before bed. Terrance sat on the porch swing with a book and a mug of decaf, occupying his usual position, establishing the visual pattern that he'd created over 3 weeks of identical evenings. At 9:42, his prepaid phone buzzed once. A text from a number listed in his contacts as Marcus, not a real person, but a relay from Morse's encrypted line. Running 20 late. Complications. He read the message, deleted it, set the phone back in his pocket. 20 minutes late was within acceptable parameters. Complications could mean anything. A supervisor lingering, a last-minute call, traffic. Nothing to escalate over. He turned a page in his book and waited. At 10:05, a light appeared in the house directly across the street. 4711, the Prescott residence. Second floor window. Diana's home office, based on Terrance's observation of her evening routine. The light had been off since 9:30. Now it was on again, and the curtain moved slightly, as if someone had pulled it aside to look out. Terrance kept reading, but his peripheral vision tracked the window. 30 seconds. A minute. The curtain moved again. Then the light went off. At 10:11, his phone buzzed a second time. Abort. Being followed. His fingers tightened on the phone. He read the message twice, deleted it, stood up slowly from the swing, gathered his book and mug, and stepped toward the front door. The porch light reflected off something at the end of the driveway. He stopped, looked. A vehicle was parked on the street, not in a driveway, not in a marked spot, just sitting at the curb with its lights off, about 40 yards east. Dark-colored sedan. He couldn't make out a model in the low light, but the silhouette was wrong for any car he'd cataloged as belonging to a neighbor. He went inside, locked the door, moved to the kitchen window that offered a sight line to the street. The sedan was still there. No dome light, no movement visible through the windshield. 4 minutes later, the sedan's headlights came on. It pulled away slowly, heading east toward the subdivision exit. No plate visible at this distance. Not in this light, not from this angle. Terrance stood in his kitchen for a long time after the car disappeared, running scenarios, calculating exposure. Morse had aborted, which meant she'd detected surveillance on her end. Someone following her route, someone watching her vehicle, something that triggered her training enough to cancel a drop that had been planned for 2 weeks. If Morse was blown, the investigation was in jeopardy. If the surveillance was routine, a supervisor checking on a junior officer's off-duty movements, departmental paranoia rather than targeted counterintelligence, then the operation could recover. But if someone in the sheriff's office had identified Morse as a cooperating witness, she was in danger. Real, immediate, the kind of danger that federal informants faced when their cover collapsed inside corrupt departments. He pulled the prepaid phone from his pocket, dialed a number he'd memorized but never saved. It rang 4 times. "It's me," he said. "The package didn't arrive. My contact reported surveillance and aborted." The voice on the other end belonged to Supervisory Special Agent Denise Radford, his handler at the Raleigh field office. Calm, professional. The voice of someone who'd managed dozens of these operations and understood that setbacks were built into the timeline. "Are you compromised?" "Unknown. There was an unidentified vehicle on my street 10 minutes ago. Could be coincidence. Could be correlated. Stay in cover. Don't reach out to your contact. We'll verify on our end. If she's burned, we'll verify. Don't move until we clear it." The line went dead. Terrance set the phone on the counter, pulled a glass from the cabinet, filled it with tap water, drank it slowly, standing at the kitchen sink, watching the street through the gap in the curtains. The sedan did not return. He didn't sleep. By 7 a.m. Friday, the neighborhood was awake. Sprinklers hissing on manicured lawns, garage doors rolling up. The commuter exodus that emptied Colton Ridge every weekday morning, leaving behind retirees, remote workers, and stay-at-home parents. Terrance maintained his routine. Coffee on the porch, the swing creaking under his weight. The morning was humid, the sky thick with clouds that couldn't decide whether to rain. He sat, read nothing, watched everything. His body language projected calm. Inside, every sense was calibrated to detect anomalies. At 7:22, Diana Prescott walked past on the sidewalk. She didn't wave, didn't nod. She glanced at his porch, at him, at the Ring camera, at the coffee mug, and kept walking. Her pace was faster than her usual morning stroll. Her phone was in her hand, not in her pocket. At 8:45, a Durham County Sheriff's cruiser drove through the subdivision. Not unusual in itself, patrol cars occasionally looped through residential areas, especially neighborhoods that had active watch programs. But Terrance had been logging patrol patterns for 3 weeks, and this cruiser was off schedule. The morning route through Colton Ridge typically happened between 10 and 10:30. An 8:45 pass was outside the pattern. The cruiser slowed as it passed 4712. Didn't stop. But it slowed. The kind of deceleration that meant someone was looking at something specific, at someone specific. Terrance sipped his coffee, kept his eyes on the book, let the cruiser pass, noted the unit number, 347, and the last 3 digits of the plate that were visible before it rounded the corner. By noon, 2 things had happened. First, a post appeared on the Colton Ridge Neighborhood Watch Facebook group, a private group Terrance couldn't access directly, but which Morse had been screenshotting for him weekly. The post, authored by Diana Prescott, read, "Friendly reminder to all residents. If you notice any unfamiliar individuals spending extended time outdoors in our community, especially after dark, please don't hesitate to contact non-emergency dispatch. Our safety depends on all of us staying vigilant. See something, say something." The post had 11 likes and 4 comments within the hour, including one from Janelle Prescott that read simply, "Agreed, standards matter." Second, Terrance received a text from Radford's relay line. "Contact status, unverified, package undelivered, maintain position, do not attempt recovery." Which meant Morse was still dark. Which meant the Raleigh office couldn't confirm whether she was safe. Which meant Terrance was sitting in a house that might or might not be under surveillance, waiting for information that might or might not arrive, while a cooperating witness might or might not be in danger. He made lunch, ate half of it, cleaned the kitchen, checked the ring camera footage from the previous night. The sedan appeared in 2 frames, both too dark for plate identification, both showing a vehicle shape consistent with an unmarked Crown Victoria or similar law enforcement sedan. The afternoon passed in manufactured calm. Terrance ran his usual route at 6 p.m. 2 miles through the subdivision, past houses where curtains moved as he passed, past driveways where conversations paused and resumed after he'd gone. At the corner of Birchwood and Maple Crest, a man he hadn't seen before, white, 60s, standing in his front yard with a garden hose, watched him approach and then called out without introduction. "You live around here?" "Birchwood Lane," Terrance said, not breaking stride. "Have a good evening. Didn't know anyone was renting over there." The man's voice followed him down the sidewalk. "You should introduce yourself to the block." He kept running, logged the interaction, added it to the file. By 9 p.m., the sky had cleared, and the temperature had dropped enough that the porch was comfortable. Terrance sat on the swing again. Same position, same book, same coffee. Establishing the pattern one more time. If the drop was rescheduled, he needed to be where he was expected to be. If it wasn't, he needed to look like a man with nothing unusual on his schedule. At 9:37, his prepaid buzzed. "Clean. Package rescheduled. Same time tonight. Confirm." He typed a single character, K, and deleted the thread. The drop was back on. Morse was safe, or at least safe enough to attempt the delivery again. Whatever surveillance she had detected last night had either been a false alarm or had been successfully evaded. Terrance set the phone down, exhaled, resumed waiting. At 10:12, 3 minutes before the scheduled drop, headlights appeared at the east end of Birchwood Lane. Not Morse's car. Morse drove a silver Honda Civic, and this vehicle's headlight configuration was higher, wider, an SUV or a truck. The vehicle slowed, pulled to the curb 3 houses down, engine off, lights off. Terrance's hand moved to his pocket, touched the phone, didn't pull it out. 30 seconds passed, a minute. The vehicle sat. Then a figure emerged, not from the driver's side but from the passenger side, which meant there were at least 2 people in the vehicle. The figure walked toward 4712. Confident stride. Purpose in the walk. Not Morse. Not even close. The figure was Diana Prescott. She stopped on the sidewalk in front of Terrance's house, phone already raised to her ear. "Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious person." Her voice was clear enough to carry in the still night air. She was making sure he heard. 4712. Birchwood Lane, Colton Ridge subdivision. There's a man sitting on the porch in the dark. He's been out here every night this week. I don't recognize him, and frankly, several of us in the neighborhood are concerned about recent activity at this address. She paused, listening. Then, "No, I haven't seen a weapon. But he's sitting there, in the dark. It's after 10 p.m. I've never seen him interact with anyone. He doesn't have any furniture delivered, doesn't seem to have a job. I'm sorry, I just think someone should come check on the situation." Another pause. "Prescott. Diana Prescott. I'm the HOA president." She gave the address, gave her callback number, thanked the dispatcher, ended the call. Then she turned, looked directly at Terrance on the porch, held eye contact for 3 full seconds, and walked back to the waiting vehicle, which started its engine, turned around, and disappeared down Birchwood Lane. Terrance didn't move. His coffee had gone cold. His book sat open on a page he hadn't read. The Ring camera had captured the entire call. The audio would need enhancement, but the visual was clean enough. Diana Prescott, standing on a public sidewalk, making a 911 call about a man sitting on his own porch. The drop was dead. Even if Morse drove past in the next 3 minutes, he couldn't retrieve anything from the mailbox with a police response en route. Any approach to the front of the property would be visible to arriving officers, and any unexplained object retrieved from the porch would generate questions he couldn't answer without blowing 14 months of work. He sent one character to the relay line, X, and waited for what was coming next. It took 7 minutes. The first cruiser came from the east, lights on, no siren, moving at the controlled speed of a unit responding to a non-emergency call. It parked at the curb in front of 4712, positioning itself so the headlights illuminated the porch at an angle that would make it difficult for Terrance to see past the glare. Tactical parking. Not the habit of an officer responding to a routine welfare check. The driver's door opened. A figure stepped out, silhouetted against the cruiser's light bar. Tall, broad across the shoulders. Moving with the exaggerated deliberation of someone who wanted his approach to feel like an event. "Durham County Sheriff's Office." The voice was young, confident, loud enough to carry. "Sir, I need you to step off the porch." Terrance didn't stand. He stayed on the swing, both hands visible, one holding the coffee mug and the other resting on the armrest. "Good evening, officer. I live here. Is there something I can help you with?" The officer reached the bottom of the porch steps. The light from the doorbell camera caught his nameplate, Fitch, and his badge number, 2241. Young face, late 20s, jaw set in the expression of a man who'd already decided how this encounter was going to go. "We received a call about suspicious activity at this address. I need you to step off the porch and provide identification." "I'm happy to provide identification. My wallet's inside. I'd need to go in and get it." "Don't go inside." The words came fast, sharp. "Stay where you are. Hands where I can see them." "My hands are visible. I'm sitting on my porch, on my property, doing nothing unlawful." A second cruiser pulled up behind the first. This one parked at an angle, blocking the driveway, a technique called boxing, designed to prevent a subject's vehicle from leaving. A female officer emerged, shorter, moving more cautiously. She approached the first cruiser and conferred briefly with Fitch before taking a position at the base of the driveway, one hand on her radio. That was Morse. Terrance recognized her walk. The particular way she shifted weight to her left side, the result of a knee she'd tweaked in the academy and never fully rehabbed. She was on shift tonight. She was here. And she was trapped in exactly the same impossible position that Terrance had wargamed in his briefings with Radford, a cooperating witness responding to a call involving the agent she was feeding information to, unable to intervene without destroying her cover and possibly both their careers. Morse's face was professionally blank. She didn't look at Terrance any differently than she'd look at any subject on a call. Perfect composure. The kind of discipline that the Bureau looked for when recruiting inside sources, and the kind that kept people alive in situations where one wrong glance could unravel everything. "Sir?" Fitch was on the porch now, 3 feet away, his flashlight beam pinning Terrance in place. "I'm not going to ask again. Stand up. Turn around, hands behind your back." "Officer Fitch?" Terrance used the name deliberately, reading it from the nameplate. "I'm a resident of this address. I've committed no crime. I'm not obstructing your investigation. I'll provide identification if you give me the opportunity to retrieve my wallet from inside." "You don't get to tell me how this works." Fitch's hand moved to Terrance's left shoulder. Not a touch, a grab. Fingers closing around the trapezius muscle and squeezing hard enough to compress nerve against bone. The pain was immediate, sharp, designed to produce compliance through sheer physicality. Terrance didn't resist. He stood when pulled, slowly, keeping his hands open and away from his body. He'd been trained for this, not in law enforcement scenarios, but in survival, evasion, resistance exercises that taught you how to absorb hostile contact without escalating. How to let the other person's aggression become evidence rather than justification. "Turn around." He turned. Fitch kicked his feet apart, a sweep that caught his right ankle and spread his stance wider than necessary, destabilizing his balance. Then the hands were on his back, pushing him forward, bending him over the porch railing. "I am not resisting," Terrance said. Clear, calm, loud enough for the body cam, loud enough for the ring camera. "I live at this address. I am compliant." "Shut up." The pat-down was aggressive, hands moving through his pockets with more force than purpose, pulling the lining out of his jacket, squeezing the fabric of his pants pockets hard enough to feel like a punch against his thigh. The prepaid phone came out first, then his house keys, then a receipt from Harris Teeter. Fitch examined each item with the flashlight, holding them at angles as if searching for something that would retroactively justify the level of force he was already using. "No ID on you?" "I told you, it's inside." "Convenient." "It's my house." Fitch grabbed the back of Terrance's neck. Not a control hold, a dominance hold, the kind of grip that said, "I can do whatever I want, and we both know it." He pushed Terrance down, off the railing and onto the porch boards. Terrance's knees hit the wood first, a crack of kneecap on hardwood that sent pain radiating up both legs. Then Fitch's hand was on the back of his head, pressing down, and his knee came up and planted between Terrance's shoulder blades with his full body weight behind it. Prone position, face against the porch, arms pulled behind his back, handcuffs ratcheting closed, tight, 2 clicks past comfortable, the metal biting into the skin at the base of both wrists. "You hear me? I said, don't move." Terrance's cheek was pressed against the wood. He could see the edge of the ring camera's field of view. The small black device mounted 6 inches above the doorframe, its indicator light pulsing. Recording. Uploading. Documenting every second of a man being forced face down on his own porch for the crime of sitting outside after dark. "I am not resisting," he said again. His voice was steady, despite the pressure on his spine. "I am a resident of 4712 Birchwood Lane. My name is Terrance Calloway. I am cooperating." "Yeah, well, cooperating people don't sit in the dark watching the street." Fitch leaned harder. The knee dug in. "Cooperating people answer questions and show ID. You didn't give me the chance to retrieve my ID. I gave you a lawful order. You gave me a contradictory order. You told me to stay where I was and provide identification that was inside the house. I can't do both." The logic landed. Fitch felt it land. The micro-hesitation, the slight shift in weight that came when someone realized they'd created a procedural problem they couldn't undo. He covered it with authority. "You're being detained pending identification verification. When we confirm who you are and that you're authorized to be at this address, you'll be released. Detained on what grounds? Suspicious activity. We had a report. Sitting on a porch is not suspicious activity under North Carolina General Statute Chapter 14. There is no loitering ordinance in Durham County that applies to private residential property. Fitch pulled Terrance's right arm higher. The cuff chain twisted, torquing both wrists. Pain shot from wrist to elbow. Terrance inhaled sharply but didn't cry out. You want to play lawyer, you can play lawyer at the station. Morse was standing at the base of the porch steps. She hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. Her body cam was running. Terrance could see the green indicator light on her chest-mounted unit. She was watching her colleague prone out a federal agent on his own porch, and the only thing keeping her from intervening was the same thing keeping Terrance from identifying himself. 14 months of work, 16 witnesses, 200 pages of documentation, and the knowledge that revealing the truth right now would save one man and lose a case that could save hundreds. Fitch pulled Terrance to his feet. The motion was rough, a yank on the cuff chain that forced his shoulders into an unnatural angle and made him stumble forward. Fitch caught him by the collar, steadied him with a grip that was less about assistance and more about control, and steered him toward the porch steps. Walk. At the bottom of the steps, Morse stepped aside. Her eyes met Terrance's for exactly 1 second. Long enough to communicate everything, short enough to be invisible to Fitch. I'm sorry, I can't. You know why. He knew. He'd briefed her himself on the protocol for exactly this scenario. If the cover agent is detained by local law enforcement, the cooperating witness does not intervene. Maintain cover. Continue documenting. Let the Bureau's response protocols handle extraction. Except the Bureau didn't know this was happening yet. His phone was on the porch in a pile of belongings. The Ring camera was recording, but the real-time feed went to a server, not to a person. Nobody was watching. Nobody was coming. Not yet. Fitch marched him to the cruiser. The back door was already open. Terrance ducked his head, protecting himself, because Fitch made no effort to guide him safely into the vehicle. His shoulder clipped the doorframe. The impact was sharp enough to leave a bruise he'd document tomorrow. The cruiser smelled like fast food and disinfectant. Vinyl seats, cracked along the seams, sharp edges digging into the back of his thighs through his pants. The partition between front and back was scratched plexiglass, opaque with years of wear. A mobile data terminal glowed on the dash. Terrance could see the edge of the screen but not the content. Fitch slammed the door. The sound was final, punctuating. The sound of a man who believed he'd won. Through the cruiser window, Terrance watched Morse return to her vehicle, watched her close the door, watched her sit behind the wheel with both hands on the dash, staring straight ahead, her expression locked in the particular neutrality of someone who was memorizing every detail for a report she couldn't write yet. Fitch was on his radio. The words were muffled through the glass, but Terrance caught fragments. One in custody. Suspicious person call. No ID. Uncooperative. Uncooperative. The word that appeared in every report Terrance had ever reviewed, where an officer needed to justify force that wouldn't survive scrutiny. The man was uncooperative. The man refused commands. The man's behavior warranted the response. The man was sitting on his own porch. The cruiser pulled away from 4712 Birchwood Lane at 10:28 p.m. Terrance's coffee was cooling on the porch boards. His book lay open, pages fluttering in a breeze that had picked up since the clouds cleared. The Ring camera recorded the cruiser's departure, taillights shrinking down Birchwood Lane until they turned right onto Maple Crest and disappeared. The porch was empty. The night was quiet. And on the screen of Diana Prescott's laptop in the second-floor window of 4711 Birchwood Lane, the Colton Ridge Neighborhood Watch Facebook group refreshed with a new post. Update. Officers responded quickly to the situation on Birchwood. Individual has been removed. Thank you all for staying vigilant. This is why our watch program works. 38 likes before midnight. The Durham County Sheriff's Office substation on Holloway Road sat between a tire shop and a vacant lot, surrounded by a parking area that needed repaving 2 administrations ago. Concrete block construction, steel doors. The kind of building that looked like it had been designed to contain rather than serve. Fitch pulled the cruiser into the sally port, the enclosed garage bay used for secure prisoner transfer, and killed the engine. The bay door rolled down behind them, cutting off the outside world with a mechanical groan that echoed off the concrete walls. "Sit tight." Fitch stepped out, leaving Terrance in the back seat with the doors locked and the air conditioning off. The bay was warm, poorly ventilated, thick with the smell of motor oil and something chemical that might have been cleaning solution, or might have been something worse. The waiting was deliberate. Let the subject sit. Let the temperature climb. Let discomfort do the preliminary work of compliance. 4 minutes. Terrance counted them internally, the way he'd been taught during survival training, not watching a clock, but marking intervals against his breathing. Each exhale a metronome ticking toward a total he filed away for documentation. Then the door opened. Fitch, plus another officer. Terrance read the nameplate through the open door. Hewitt. Older. Rounder. Less intensity, but more practiced indifference. The expression of a man who processed people like parcels. They pulled him out of the cruiser by the arms, one on each side, and walked him through a metal door into the booking area. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, that institutional blue-white that made everyone look ill. A booking desk along the far wall, manned by a sergeant whose nameplate read, Barrack, mid-40s, thinning hair, reading glasses perched on a nose that looked like it had been broken at least once. He didn't look up when they entered. "What have we got?" Barrack's voice was flat, routine. "Suspicious person, Colton Ridge. No ID. Uncooperative on scene. Possible trespass." "Possible?" Barrack looked up now, over the glasses. "Either he was trespassing, or he wasn't. He claims he lives at the address. No identification to confirm." "Did you run the address?" Silence. Barrack set down his pen, looked at Fitch with the expression of a man who had processed 1,000 arrests and could distinguish between a solid collar and a waste of paperwork in about 4 seconds. "You brought me a guy who says he lives at the address, you didn't run the address, and your probable cause is a suspicious person call?" He looked at Terrance for the first time, assessed him the way a mechanic assesses a car, not with hostility, but with the cold calculation of someone determining how much work this was going to require. "Book him for obstruction pending ID verification," Fitch said. He refused to identify himself. "I did not refuse." Terrance's voice was steady. "I offered to retrieve my wallet from inside the residence. I was told not to enter the house. Then I was detained before any alternative was offered." Barrack's pen tapped the desk twice. He looked at Fitch again. "You could have knocked on the door, looked for mail with his name on it, run the lease through Henderson Realty's after-hours line. Any of those options occur to you?" Fitch's jaw tightened. He was being difficult. Standing on his own porch isn't difficult. It's standing on his own porch. Barrack's voice carried the weariness of a man who'd seen too many officers create problems they could have avoided. But the weariness didn't translate into action. He picked up his pen, pulled a booking form from a tray. "Name?" "Terrance Calloway. Date of birth, April 2nd, 1987. I'm a tenant at 4712 Birchwood Lane, Colton Ridge, leased through Henderson Realty," Barrack wrote. Slowly, every stroke deliberate, as if the pace itself were a statement. "Social?" "I'm not required to provide my social security number during a booking for a misdemeanor detention." Terrance kept his voice measured. "I'll provide it to a judge if charges are filed." Barrack looked up, studied him for a moment. The way Terrance spoke, the precision, the legal awareness, the absolute absence of panic, was registering, filing into whatever mental categorization system the sergeant used to sort the people who came through his booking desk. "Occupation?" "IT consultant. Self-employed." "Emergency contact?" Terrance paused. The real answer was Supervisory Special Agent Denise Radford, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Raleigh Field Office. The cover answer was a name he'd memorized from a contact sheet prepared by the Bureau's Identity Management Unit. Vivian Calloway, my sister, 919-555-0147. The number was real. It connected to a Bureau voicemail that would respond appropriately to any inquiry, confirming Terrance's identity without revealing anything classified. The sister was fictional. The backstop was airtight. Barrick wrote the number, didn't call it. Empty your pockets. He pushed a clear property bag across the desk. Officer Fitch already removed my personal belongings on scene. They should be in his possession. Fitch produced the items: prepaid phone, house keys, the Harris Teeter receipt. He set them on the desk with more force than necessary, the phone bouncing once before Barrick caught it. That everything? That's what was on him. Barrick inventoried each item, writing descriptions on a property form. He picked up the prepaid phone, turned it over. Basic model, no branding. The kind of phone people used when they didn't want to be tracked, which could mean a dozen different things, not all of them criminal, but none of them comfortable for a booking sergeant to explain away. No smartphone? That's my phone. Terrance didn't elaborate. Barrick set the phone in the bag, sealed it, wrote the seal number on the form, pushed the form toward Terrance. Sign. Terrance read the form, every line, every checkbox. Barrick watched him read, the pen tapping resuming at a slower cadence that might have been impatience or might have been something else. The arrest charge listed here says obstruction of a law enforcement officer, Terrance said. North Carolina General Statute Section 14-223. That statute requires willful and unlawful resistance, delay, or obstruction of a public officer in discharging an official duty. I didn't resist, delay, or obstruct. I offered to produce identification and was prevented from doing so by Officer Fitch's own commands. Take it up with the magistrate. Barrick's voice was flat, but something shifted in his eyes. A flicker that might have been recognition. Not of Terrance specifically, but of the type. The person who knew statutes. The person who read forms before signing. The person who was going to be a problem. Terrance signed, handed the form back. The fingerprinting was methodical. Barrick pressed each finger into the ink pad and rolled it across the card with practiced efficiency. Not gentle, but not unnecessarily rough. The professional detachment of a man who'd done this 10,000 times and had stopped seeing the people attached to the fingers a long time ago. The photograph was worse. Not because of the camera, but because of the location. The mugshot wall, a square of marked paint with height lines behind it, sat in the open booking area, visible to anyone walking through. Fitch leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching with the satisfied expression of a man who believed the universe was confirming his world view. Terrance stood straight, looked at the camera, gave it nothing. No anger, no fear, no defiance. Just a face, just data. Let them have the photograph. It would become evidence in their prosecution, not his. Processing complete. Barrick pulled the finished paperwork into a file folder. Magistrate available at 8 a.m. for bond hearing. Until then, you're held on the obstruction charge. I'm entitled to a phone call. After processing. Processing is complete. You just said so. Barrick exhaled through his nose, looked at the clock. 10:58 p.m. Phone's down the hall. 5 minutes. He gestured to Hewitt. Walk him. Hewitt led Terrance to a wall-mounted phone near the holding area. The handset was greasy, the number pad worn smooth from thousands of fingers. Terrance picked it up, dialed a number. Not Radford's line. Not the Bureau relay. He dialed the number on the property form, the sister line, Vivian Calloway, which connected to the Bureau's backstop voicemail. Hey, it's me. I've been picked up by Durham County, Holloway Road substation, obstruction charge. It's bogus. I'm fine. Can you call Henderson Realty in the morning and get them to confirm the lease? And call Dennis. He paused, repeated. Call Dennis. Tell him I won't make the meeting tomorrow. Dennis was the bureau code for handler notification. The voicemail system would transcribe the message, flag the code word, and route it to Radford's desk within minutes. By midnight, the Raleigh field office would know where he was. By morning, they'd have to decide what to do about it. He hung up. Hewitt walked him to the holding cell. This story takes a turn you won't expect. Stick around, because the truth about who this man really is changes everything. The holding cell at the Holloway Road substation was a concrete box with a metal bench, a steel toilet with no seat, and a drain in the floor that smelled like it hadn't been cleaned since the building opened. One overhead light, fluorescent, sealed behind a wire cage, cast the kind of light that erased shadows and made time impossible to track. Terrance sat on the bench, back against the wall, hands in his lap, finally free of the cuffs. Hewitt had removed them during booking, which was procedure, though the red marks on both wrists told the story of how tight Fitch had applied them. He sat, breathed, counted. Not counting time, counting evidence, building the mental file that he'd been constructing since the first flashlight beam hit his face on the porch. Officer Leon Fitch, badge 2241, arrived at 4712 Birchwood Lane at 10:21 p.m. in response to a suspicious person call. Made no attempt to verify residency before initiating contact. Used physical force. Grab, push, prone position with knee to back. Within approximately 90 seconds of contact, before any refusal or resistance occurred. Applied handcuffs, 2 clicks past standard tightness, causing visible marking and restricted circulation. Did not run address through dispatch before transporting subject to station. Charged obstruction under NCGS Section 14-223 without establishing elements of the offense. Sergeant Glenn Barrick, booking desk. Identified the procedural deficiency in the arrest. No address check, no ID verification attempted, but processed the booking anyway. Noted but did not act on the conflict between Fitch's stated probable cause and the facts presented by the subject. Officer Janelle Morse, badge 1847, present on scene as backup, did not intervene during use of force, maintained appropriate distance, body cam active. The cell was cold, deliberately cold, the same tactic he'd documented in 12 other booking facilities during the 14-month investigation. Environmental discomfort as compliance tool, not technically a violation of anything, but a pattern that spoke to institutional culture. At 11:32, footsteps approached. Not Fitch, not Barrick. A different rhythm, slower, heavier. The walk of someone who wasn't in a hurry because the building was his territory. The cell door opened. A man stood in the frame, lean, mid-30s, sport coat over a department polo, badge clipped to his belt rather than pinned to his chest. Detectives carry. The kind of man who showed up after hours when something interesting landed in the holding cell. Mr. Calloway. The detective stepped inside. Didn't sit. Stood against the opposite wall with his hands in his jacket pockets, projecting the casual authority of a man who wanted you to think this was informal. I'm Detective Coulter, Investigative Division. Mind if I ask you a few questions? Am I being interrogated? It's a conversation. Then I'd like my attorney present. You haven't been charged with anything that requires an attorney. This is just a chat. Terrance said nothing. Let the silence do work. Coulter studied him. Not the surface assessment that Fitch had performed, but something deeper. The detective was reading him, looking for tells, looking for the thing that didn't fit. Interesting phone you've got. Coulter pulled a chair from somewhere. There wasn't one in the cell, which meant he'd brought it, and sat down, crossing one ankle over the opposite knee. Relaxed posture, practiced informality. Prepaid, no contacts saved, no call history, the kind of phone people use when they don't want anyone knowing who they're talking to. Or the kind of phone people use when they can't afford a contract. Is my financial status relevant to the obstruction charge? Coulter smiled. Not warmth, acknowledgement, the way a poker player smiles when the hand gets interesting. What kind of IT consulting do you do, Mr. Calloway? The kind covered by client confidentiality agreements. You work from home? I work remotely. For who? For clients. Named? Confidential. The smile stayed. Coulter uncrossed his legs, leaned forward slightly. Here's what I'm looking at, Terrance. A man nobody knows moves into a quiet neighborhood 3 weeks ago, pays cash deposit through a management company, drives an older vehicle registered to a P.O. box in Raleigh. Yeah, we ran your plates. Keeps unusual hours. Doesn't interact with neighbors. Has a security camera that feeds to an unregistered cloud server and carries a burner phone with 0 data on it. He paused. Let the inventory settle. Now, I'm not saying any of that's illegal, but you've got to admit, from where I sit, it paints a particular picture. Terrance kept his expression neutral. But inside, something shifted. A recalibration, a recognition that this encounter had changed categories. Fitch was a blunt instrument, a patrol officer operating on bias and adrenaline. Coulter was something else. Coulter was investigating. And Coulter's name was in the case file. Detective Raymond Coulter, Investigative Division, Durham County Sheriff's Office. 12 years on the force. Lead investigator on 16 civil asset forfeiture cases in the past 2 years, all targeting Black or Latino motorists, all resulting in cash seizures, none resulting in criminal charges. 3 of those cases were currently flagged in the FBI's pattern or practice review as potential civil rights violations. Coulter wasn't just a detective asking questions. Coulter was a subject of the investigation that Terrance was running, and he was sitting 3 feet away in a holding cell studying the man who was building the case against him. I'm invoking my right to counsel. Terrance's voice didn't change. I won't be answering any further questions without an attorney present. Coulter stood, slowly. The chair scraped against concrete. Your call. He moved toward the door, then stopped, turned back. One thing, though, that security camera on your porch, the ring unit. We'll need access to that footage as part of the investigation into tonight's call. There's no investigation. There's a suspicious person call that resulted in a false arrest. There's an open case file now, Mr. Calloway, and in an open case we're entitled to request relevant surveillance footage from the area. Request, not seize, and I'm declining the request. Coulter's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, but Terrance had been trained to read micro-expressions the way most people read road signs. We can get a warrant. Then get a warrant, and I'll challenge it. The door closed, the lock engaged. Footsteps retreated. Terrance sat in the cold cell and thought about the camera on his porch. The ring unit was uploading to a federal server through an encrypted pipeline. If Coulter pursued a warrant, the warrant application would go to a Durham County magistrate. The magistrate would issue the warrant based on Coulter's affidavit. Coulter's team would attempt to access the ring account, and they would hit a wall. The account was registered to Tidewater Digital Solutions, LLC, which was a shell company, which was managed by a registered agent in Wilmington, which was controlled by the FBI. The warrant would trigger a federal notification. The notification would reach the Raleigh field office. And at that point, the Bureau would have to decide, let the warrant proceed and risk exposing the shell company, or intervene and reveal that the man in the holding cell wasn't an IT consultant. Either way, Coulter had just set in motion a chain of events that would eventually circle back to him. He just didn't know it yet. At 12:14 a.m., the cell door opened again. This time it was Hewitt, carrying a clear plastic bag. Property update. He set the bag on the bench beside Terrance. Detective Coulter asked us to do a secondary inventory of your belongings. Terrance looked at the bag. The items were the same: phone, keys, receipt, plus one addition. A small orange prescription bottle, white label, no name on the prescription. Generic markings that could be anything from aspirin to oxycodone. That's not mine. It was found in your jacket pocket during secondary search. My jacket was searched on scene by Officer Fitch. Those were the only items recovered. That bottle was not in my possession at any point. Hewitt's expression didn't change. I'm just logging what was found, sir. You're logging what was planted. Hewitt set a supplemental property form on the bench. Sign here acknowledging the updated inventory. I will not sign a form acknowledging possession of an item that was placed in my property after booking. Your signature is required for, my signature acknowledges receipt of an inventory that's been tampered with. I'm declining to sign, and I'm noting for the record, assuming this cell has audio monitoring, that a prescription bottle with no identifiable markings appeared in my property bag between the hours of 11 p.m. and 12:15 a.m., during which time my belongings were in the sole custody of the Durham County Sheriff's Office. Hewitt looked at him, looked at the bag, looked at the form. Then he picked up both, turned, and left without another word. The door closed. The lock engaged. Terrance leaned back against the wall, closed his eyes. Not sleeping. Processing. The bottle was a plant. Clean, professional. The kind of evidence fabrication that appeared in case files so often it had its own taxonomy in the FBI's civil rights database. Drop and document. Introduce a controlled substance into a subject's property during custody. Then use the discovery to upgrade charges from misdemeanor to felony, transforming a questionable arrest into a justifiable one. Coulter had done this before. The case file documented 3 similar instances, all involving motorists detained on I-40 or Route 70, all producing surprise discoveries of pills or small quantities of narcotics during property inventory, all leading to forfeiture of cash and vehicles. The difference was that those subjects hadn't known what was happening. They'd been confused, frightened, unable to articulate what had occurred until long after the evidence was cataloged and the system had closed around them. Terrance knew. He'd recognized the play before it was complete. He'd verbally documented the discrepancy in real time, and he'd refused to sign, which meant the property form sat in administrative limbo, acknowledged by Hewitt but not confirmed by the subject, a gap that would matter enormously when this case reached federal court. If it reached federal court, if Radford received the coded voicemail, if the Bureau decided to act, if the 14-month investigation survived the exposure that intervention would create. A lot of ifs for a man sitting in a concrete box at midnight. At 1:07 a.m., footsteps again. Heavier this time. More deliberate. The footsteps of authority, not errand. The cell door opened. A man filled the frame. 50s, silver at the temples, dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, a bearing that said, "Command without requiring a uniform." His badge was clipped to a leather belt that held no weapon. Administrative carry, off-duty response. Someone had called him in. "Mr. Calloway." The voice was deep, unhurried, the cadence of a man who was accustomed to speaking and being listened to. "I'm Deputy Chief Taggart. I understand we have a situation. The situation is that I was arrested on my own porch for no articulable offense, and I've been held for nearly 3 hours without bond or access to a magistrate." Taggart entered the cell, stood, didn't sit, looked down at Terrance with an expression that combined assessment with something harder to name. Not hostility exactly, but the particular wariness of a man who managed institutions and recognized threats to institutional stability. "I've reviewed the arrest report. I've spoken with Officer Fitch and Detective Coulter." He paused. "And I've spoken with the caller, Mrs. Prescott, who confirms that you've been the subject of multiple community concerns since your arrival. Community concerns about a black man moving into a white neighborhood are not probable cause for arrest." Taggart's expression tightened. Nobody said anything about race. Nobody had to. The 911 call was made by a woman standing on the sidewalk in front of my house, reporting me for sitting on my own porch. 3 weeks of notes in my mailbox. My car was vandalized, and I'm currently in a holding cell because an officer chose to use force rather than run my address through dispatch. Taggart said nothing for a moment. He was calculating. Terrance could see it. The same political math that every mid-level law enforcement administrator performed when a detention started to look more like a liability than a success. "Here's what I'm going to do." Taggart's tone shifted, conciliatory on the surface, immovable underneath. "We're going to hold you until the morning magistrate session, 8 a.m. Your bond hearing will be scheduled, and if the magistrate determines the charge is insufficient, you'll be released. Hold me for 10 hours on a misdemeanor charge that your own booking sergeant questioned? Sergeant Barrick processed the arrest according to procedure. After noting on the record that Officer Fitch didn't run the address, your own people identified the problem, and you're choosing to extend it. Taggart moved toward the door, stopped. Mr. Calloway, I don't know who you are. I don't know what you're doing in Colton Ridge, but I know what a man with a burner phone and a camera feeding to an unknown server looks like, and it doesn't look like an IT consultant. He looked back over his shoulder. Get some sleep. The magistrate will sort it out. The door closed. The lock engaged. The fluorescent light hummed. Terrance sat in the cold. The hours that followed were the kind that existed outside normal time, stretching, contracting, measured only by the intervals between footsteps in the corridor and the occasional clank of the building's heating system cycling on and off. He didn't sleep. He catalogued. Deputy Chief Neil Taggart. Badge number not visible. Administrative personnel often didn't display badge numbers on civilian clothing, which was itself a policy worth noting. Arrived at the substation at approximately 1 a.m. in response to a call. From whom? Fitch wouldn't have the authority to wake a deputy chief for a suspicious person detention. Barrick might, if the booking raised flags. But Coulter would. Coulter had the rank and the relationships and the specific self-interest that would make a late-night call to the deputy chief worth the political cost. Which meant Coulter had escalated this. Not because a man without ID was sitting in holding, but because something about Terrance had triggered a recognition that went beyond routine. The phone, the camera, the way he'd spoken, citing statutes, refusing to sign the tampered inventory, invoking counsel with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it before. Coulter was worried, and worried detectives made mistakes. At 3:22 a.m. the building went quiet. Night shift skeleton crew, Hewitt at the desk, one other officer whose name Terrance hadn't caught monitoring the dispatch radio. The station settled into the particular stillness of a facility with nothing happening, the kind of silence that amplified small sounds into significance. Terrance's wrists throbbed. The cuff marks had deepened from red to purple, the bruising settling into the tissue the way bruises do when pressure has been sustained long enough to rupture capillaries. He held his hands under the fluorescent light and examined them, not for medical reasons, but for documentation. When this reached court, the marks would be photographed, measured, compared against the standard operating procedure for handcuff application that every law enforcement agency in the country published, but few enforced. 2 clicks passed standard. He could feel exactly where the metal had compressed the ulnar styloid process, the bony prominence at the outside of the wrist, hard enough to potentially cause nerve damage. Not the careless over-tightening of an anxious officer. The deliberate application of pain by someone who understood that handcuffs were a tool of compliance as much as restraint. He rested his hands in his lap, closed his eyes, not sleeping, waiting. At 4:15, a noise from the corridor, different from the shift change sounds he'd been tracking. This was a civilian noise, shoes that clicked instead of thudded, the particular rhythm of someone who moved through police stations as a visitor rather than a resident. The cell door opened. A woman stood there, early 40s, dark hair pulled back, wireframe glasses, a leather bag slung over one shoulder that looked like it had survived law school, the bar exam, and a decade of courtroom warfare. Her badge read, Durham County Public Defender's Office. Her nameplate read, Ostrowski. Mr. Calloway? She entered without waiting for confirmation, pulling a chair from the corridor. The same chair Coulter had used, which meant it had been left there, which meant Coulter expected to come back. I'm Lena Ostrowski, night duty public defender. I was notified of your booking at 10:58 p.m., but I wasn't able to get here until now. I apologize for the delay. Notified at 10:58, but arriving at 4:15, 5-hour gap. She sat down, opened her bag. Opened, pulled out a legal pad and a pen. I had 3 other bookings ahead of you. 2 in-custody arraignments, and the magistrate's clerk fell asleep at his desk, which, honestly, is a Tuesday in this building. She looked at him directly. How are you being treated? I was detained without probable cause, subjected to excessive force during the arrest, and a prescription bottle that doesn't belong to me appeared in my property bag after booking. Ostrowski's pen stopped. She looked up. Say that last part again. During booking, Officer Fitch inventoried 3 items from my person: a prepaid phone, house keys, and a grocery receipt. Those items were sealed in a property bag. Approximately 90 minutes later, Officer Hewitt presented a supplemental inventory containing a 4th item, a prescription bottle with no label, no name, no identifiable markings. I declined to sign the updated form. Good. The word came out fast, certain. Don't sign anything else. Did anyone explain the chain of custody between the first and second inventory? No. The supplemental search was described as having been ordered by Detective Coulter. Ostrowski wrote, fast. Her handwriting was dense and angled, the kind that developed in people who took notes in rooms where recordings weren't allowed. Coulter ordered a secondary search of property that was already sealed and inventoried. She wasn't asking. She was verbalizing the procedural violation to make sure it existed in her notes as a contemporaneous record. That's a chain of custody breach. The seal was broken after initial processing. Correct. Was anyone else present when Hewitt presented the supplemental inventory? No, just Hewitt and myself. No supervisor sign-off? None that I was shown. She wrote for another 30 seconds. Then she set the pen down and looked at him. Really looked, the way lawyers look at clients when they're trying to determine whether the story in front of them is the story they're going to take into court. Mr. Calloway, I'm going to be direct with you. I've been doing night duty at this station for 4 years. I've processed 600 bookings through this facility. And what you're describing, the force, the planted evidence, the extended hold without magistrate access, it's not random. She paused, chose her next words carefully. This station has patterns. Patterns I've been documenting. Patterns that I've reported to the district attorney's office, which has done exactly nothing with them. She closed the legal pad. I'm going to file an emergency motion for your release at the 8 a.m. magistrate hearing. I'm also going to file a formal complaint with the clerk of court regarding the chain of custody breach, and I'd recommend you retain private counsel for any civil action you might pursue after this is resolved. I appreciate that. One more thing. She reached into her bag and produced a form, a standard rights advisement acknowledgement, but with a section at the bottom she'd highlighted in yellow. This is the booking timestamp log. Every arrest processed through this station generates a digital timestamp when the booking form is initiated, and a second stamp when it's completed. Your booking was initiated at 10:47 p.m. That's consistent with my arrival. Your booking was completed at 11:22 p.m. Also consistent. Except the arrest report filed by Officer Fitch lists the time of arrest as 10:31 p.m., and dispatch records show the call from Mrs. Prescott was logged at 10:08 p.m. She pulled a second sheet from her bag. That means Fitch responded, made contact, arrested you, transported you, and arrived at the station in 16 minutes. Terrance looked at the numbers. 10:08. Dispatch call. 10:31. Listed arrest time. 10:47. Booking initiation. Colton Ridge to this station is a 12-minute drive, Ostrowski continued. Minimum, which gives Fitch 4 minutes from the time dispatch logged the call to the time he claims the arrest occurred. 4 minutes to drive to the address, make contact, assess the situation, attempt identification, determine probable cause, and effect an arrest. That's not possible. No, it's not. Which means either the arrest time is wrong, and the report is inaccurate, or Officer Fitch was already in the area before the call was dispatched. She looked at him over her glasses, which would suggest foreknowledge of the call. The implication hung in the cell's cold air. If Fitch had been positioned near Birchwood Lane before Diana's 911 call, it wasn't a response, it was a setup. A coordinated action between a caller and an officer, planned in advance, designed to create the pretext for exactly the kind of encounter that had unfolded. Terrance filed the information, added it to the growing architecture of evidence that was building in his mind. Not the evidence for tonight's misdemeanor charge, which was already crumbling under its own procedural weight, but the evidence for the federal case. The case that now had a new data point: potential coordination between a civilian and a law enforcement officer to manufacture a pretextual stop targeting a black resident. Ms. Ostrowski, has Detective Coulter been present for any of the other bookings where you've documented irregularities? She hesitated. The hesitation of a lawyer deciding how much to share with a client she'd met 20 minutes ago. I can't discuss other cases. She stood, packed her bag. 8 a.m. Be ready. I'll have the motion prepared. She knocked on the cell door. Hewitt opened it. She stepped out without looking back, her heels clicking down the corridor with the purposeful rhythm of a woman who'd seen too much and filed too many reports that went nowhere. But she was still filing them, still showing up at 4 a.m. on a Friday morning to tell a stranger in a holding cell that the numbers didn't add up, still believing that documentation mattered even when the system designed to act on it refused to function. Terrance respected that, respected her, and silently promised that the reports she'd been filing, the ones the district attorney's office had ignored, would eventually find their way to a desk where they wouldn't be ignored. The hours between 4:30 and 7 felt like geological time. Terrance sat, breathed, counted the intervals between sounds. At 5:40, a shift change. New voices, new rhythms, the day crew arriving with coffee and conversation that filtered through the walls in indistinct murmurs. At 6:12, breakfast, a wrapped sandwich that might have been egg and cheese, pushed through the food slot with no verbal exchange. He ate it, not because he was hungry, but because refusing food in custody created medical liability issues, and he needed his energy for the morning. At 6:45, the corridor noise changed. More movement, sharper voices. The building was waking up to something. At 7:02, his cell door opened. Fitch stood there, same uniform, same expression, but something was different, a tightness around his eyes, a set to his jaw that hadn't been there last night, the look of a man who'd been told something he didn't want to hear. On your feet, you're being moved. Moved where? Different holding area. We need this cell. That's not standard procedure for a bond hearing detainee. I don't need your opinion on procedure. Stand up. Terrance stood. Fitch entered the cell and grabbed his arm, the same grip as last night, fingers closing around the bicep with more force than control required. He steered Terrance through the corridor, past the booking desk, now manned by a different sergeant, younger, who didn't look up, and through a door marked interview. Not a holding cell. An interrogation room, metal table, 2 chairs, one-way mirror, camera in the ceiling corner, red light blinking. Sit. Terrance sat. Fitch stood by the door, arms crossed, blocking the exit. Where's my attorney? She'll be here for the hearing. The hearing is at 8. It's 7:02. I should be in holding pending the hearing, not in an interrogation room. Fitch said nothing, just stood there, radiating the controlled menace of a man who believed that physical dominance was the same thing as authority. 3 minutes passed. Then the door opened and Coulter entered, carrying a file folder and a paper cup of coffee. He sat across from Terrance, set the coffee to one side, opened the folder. Morning, Mr. Calloway. How'd you sleep? I'm invoking my right to counsel. Just a conversation, no interrogation. Any interaction between a detained person and a law enforcement officer in a custodial setting constitutes interrogation for the purposes of the Fifth and Sixth Amendments. Edwards v. Arizona, 1981. I've invoked. This conversation is over unless my attorney is present. Coulter closed the folder, tapped it once with his index finger. Your attorney filed a motion this morning, emergency release, plus a complaint about the property inventory. He paused. The complaint mentions a prescription bottle you say isn't yours. I've invoked. Thing is, Terrance, We tested the contents of that bottle. Preliminary field test came back positive for oxycodone. He leaned forward. That changes the conversation from misdemeanor obstruction to felony possession, and a felony charge means no bond release at the 8 a.m. hearing. It means transfer to county and a 48-hour hold minimum. Terrance looked at Coulter, looked through him, past the detective's practiced calm and into the architecture of the play being executed, the escalation from a planted bottle to a field test to felony charges, each step designed to extend custody, to deepen the legal trap, to create enough procedural weight that the subject gave up and agreed to whatever was offered. He'd seen this play in the case file, documented it in depositions from 3 previous subjects. One of them, a 23-year-old named Marcus Rivera, had spent 4 months in county on charges that were eventually dismissed when the field test was contradicted by lab results. By then, Rivera had lost his job, his apartment, and his car. Test the contents in a certified lab, Terrance said, not a field kit. Field tests are admissible for probable cause. Field tests have a documented false positive rate of up to 33%. Any defense attorney, including the one who's currently preparing a motion in the next room, will challenge that in front of the magistrate. Coulter's expression shifted. The first crack, not in his composure, but in his certainty, the micro-adjustment that happened when a plan met resistance it hadn't anticipated. Fitch stepped forward from the door, moving into Terrance's space, close enough that Terrance could feel body heat, could see the tension in the officer's forearms, could smell coffee and something metallic, adrenaline maybe, or the particular scent of aggression masquerading as duty. "You think you're smart?" Fitch's voice was low, controlled, more dangerous than last night's shouting. "You think citing case law is going to save you?" "I think citing case law is going to save the record." Fitch's hand shot out. Not a punch, a grab. Collar of Terrance's shirt, twisted, pulling him forward across the table. Coffee spilled. The paper cup tumbled. Coulter's file slid sideways. For 3 seconds, Fitch held him there, faces inches apart, breath mixing, the physical declaration of a man who wanted you to understand that law was abstract and his fist was real. "You know what happens to smart guys in county?" Fitch whispered. "They get real quiet, real fast." "Your body cam is on," Terrance said. "And that camera in the ceiling is recording." Fitch released him, shoved him backward. The chair legs scraped against concrete. Terrance's back hit the wall behind him, a collision that would leave a mark between his shoulder blades, another entry in the catalog of force that was building toward something Fitch couldn't yet imagine. Coulter hadn't moved during the exchange, hadn't intervened, hadn't instructed his officer to stand down. The absence of intervention was its own kind of evidence, tacit approval, institutional complicity, the system protecting itself by allowing its enforcers to operate without constraint. 8 a.m. hearing is in 40 minutes. Coulter stood, gathered his file, picked up the empty coffee cup and tossed it in a waste bin by the door. "Think about your options, Terrance. A felony possession charge is a lot harder to walk away from than an obstruction misdemeanor." He left. Fitch followed. The door closed. Terrance straightened his shirt, touched the back of his head where it had contacted the wall. Tender, not bleeding. A knot forming that would be visible by afternoon. He sat in the interrogation room and waited for the hearing. 40 minutes. Less than an hour before Ostrowski would stand in front of a magistrate and argue for his release, armed with timestamp discrepancies, chain of custody violations, and the specific fury of a public defender who had been documenting this station's patterns for 4 years and had finally gotten a case that might stick. But Coulter had the pill bottle, and a field test, and the institutional machinery to convert a planted substance into a felony charge that would keep Terrance in custody long enough to search his house, access his devices, and discover things that a detective investigating public corruption in the Durham County Sheriff's Office absolutely should not discover. Because that was the real danger now. Not the misdemeanor, not even the planted pills. The danger was the house on Birchwood Lane, the laptop with the encrypted partition, the Ring camera feeding to a federal server, the locked briefcase in the car with the federal property tag, and the 14 months of investigation materials that would become visible the moment someone with a warrant and a forensics team walked through the front door. Subscribe now and turn on notifications. The next part of this story is going to change everything you think you know about the man in that holding cell. At 7:48 a.m., Ostrowski appeared at the interrogation room door. She was carrying 3 file folders and an expression that combined professional determination with something Terrance recognized from his own work. The look of a person who had found a thread and was about to pull it. Hearing's been moved to courtroom B, 9 a.m. instead of 8. Moved by whom? The magistrate's office received a request from the detective division to delay pending additional evidence review. Coulter. The request didn't specify, but yes. She sat down across from him, opened the first folder. I'm going to walk you through the motion. Listen carefully because there's something in the arrest report you need to know about. She placed the arrest report on the table between them. Fitch's signature at the bottom. Terrance's name in the subject field. The narrative section, the officer's account of the encounter, filled half a page of dense typing. Read the 4th paragraph. Terrance read. Upon approaching the subject, I observed him make furtive movements consistent with concealing an object in his right jacket pocket. Based on my training and experience, I believed the subject may have been concealing contraband or a weapon, which provided probable cause for a pat-down search pursuant to Terry v. Ohio. He looked at Ostrowski. I wasn't wearing a jacket. I know. She produced a second document, a printout from the station's intake system. The property inventory lists the following clothing: gray t-shirt, dark jeans, running shoes, no jacket. Your jacket, if you had one, wasn't booked because you weren't wearing one. Fitch cited furtive movements in a jacket pocket that didn't exist, which means either the arrest report is fabricated or Officer Fitch confused you with someone else. She closed the folder. I don't think he confused you with someone else. The implication was clear. Fitch had written the report to justify the pat-down retroactively, inventing the jacket and the furtive movements to establish the probable cause he hadn't bothered to develop on scene. It was standard, textbook even, in departments where report writing was treated as creative writing and supervisors signed off without reading. But this time, the physical evidence contradicted the narrative. No jacket in the property inventory, no jacket visible on the Ring camera footage, no jacket in any photograph taken during booking. This is enough to challenge the arrest itself, Ostrowski said. Fabricated probable cause vitiates the search, which vitiates the detention, which vitiates the obstruction charge, because you can't obstruct an officer who had no legal basis for the encounter. And the pill bottle? Fruit of the poisonous tree. If the arrest was unlawful, everything that followed, the booking, the search, the secondary inventory, is suppressed. She was right. The legal framework was solid, but Terrance had been in federal law enforcement long enough to know that legal frameworks didn't always survive contact with local magistrates, who owed their appointments to the same political structures that employed the officers being challenged. There's one more thing. Ostrowski pulled the 3rd folder open. Inside, a single sheet, a body cam activity log, printed from the station's digital evidence management system. I requested Officer Fitch's body cam footage under the Brady disclosure requirement. The log shows his camera was activated at 10:19 p.m., 12 minutes after the dispatch call, standard response time. That's consistent. The log also shows the camera's upload to the department server completed at 11:08 p.m. standard. Except, she pointed to a second entry on the log. At 2:37 a.m., an upload overwrite was initiated from terminal DA-ADMIN-04. That's a detective division desktop. The overwrite replaced 63 seconds of footage at the beginning of the recording, the first minute after the camera was activated. 63 seconds. That's the approach. The initial contact. Everything before I was on the ground. Correct. The overwrite was logged under a system administrator account, not a named user. But terminal DA-ADMIN-04 is assigned to the investigative division, and the only detective who was in this building at 2:37 a.m., based on the access log for the front door, was Raymond Coulter. The cell went quiet. The fluorescent light hummed. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang and stopped. Terrance looked at the body cam log, looked at the woman sitting across from him, a public defender making $38 an hour who had spent 4 years documenting patterns in a building that didn't want to be documented, who had pulled access logs at 4 in the morning, who had found the 63-second ghost in the machine that proved the footage had been tampered with. She didn't know who he was, didn't know what he did, didn't know that the case she was building for a 9 a.m. magistrate hearing was a subset of a case that had been building for 14 months in a field office 40 minutes east. But she was building it anyway, because that's what she did, because she believed the paperwork mattered even when nobody above her seemed to care. Ms. Ostrowski, Terrance kept his voice low, what happens if the magistrate denies the motion? Then we appeal to Superior Court, takes 2 to 3 days. And in those 2 to 3 days, you'd be transferred to Durham County Detention Center on the felony possession charge. County, general population, where a man who'd been arrested on a manufactured drug charge would sit alongside people who had no idea that the system holding them was being investigated by the man sitting next to them. Where Coulter's reach extended through deputies he'd cultivated over 12 years. Where anything could happen, and the incident report would read however Coulter wanted it to read. I'd like to make another phone call, Terrance said. Ostrowski nodded. You're entitled. I'll arrange it before the hearing. She left. The door closed, and Terrance sat in the interrogation room at 7:52 a.m., calculating odds. The ring camera had the arrest. The body cam had been tampered with. But the log proved the tampering, which was almost better than having the footage itself. The property chain was broken. The arrest report was fabricated. Ostrowski had the timestamp discrepancy and the overwrite log. Legally, the case for release was strong. But legally strong and actually released were different things in a building where detectives planted evidence and overwrote body cam footage, and deputy chiefs made late-night visits to holding cells. And somewhere in this building, or in a cruiser on a morning shift, or at home looking at a phone that hadn't rung, Janelle Morse was holding a USB drive full of evidence that would turn this station inside out, wondering whether the man who was supposed to receive it was safe, whether her own cover had survived, whether the investigation she'd risked her career to support was collapsing around the arrest of its lead agent. Terrance picked up the corridor phone when Hewitt unlocked the door, dialed the same number as last night. It's me. I'm still at Holloway Road. Hearing at 9. They've added a felony possession charge, planted evidence. My counsel found a body cam overwrite at 2:37 a.m. and a timestamp discrepancy in the arrest report. Tell Dennis the situation has escalated, and tell him... He paused, weighed the next words against protocol, against operational security, against the risk of saying too much on a line that might be monitored. Tell him the subject is active. The subject, Coulter. Active, meaning the detective wasn't just responding to a booking anomaly. He was investigating Terrance with the specific energy of a man who sensed a threat and was moving to neutralize it. He hung up. At 8:31 a.m., while Terrance sat in the interrogation room under Hewitt's supervision, a Durham County magistrate signed a search warrant for 4712 Birchwood Lane, Colton Ridge subdivision. The warrant application, prepared by Detective Raymond Coulter, cited probable cause based on the discovery of suspected controlled substances in the subject's property during booking, the subject's possession of an unregistered surveillance device, and the subject's use of a prepaid communication device consistent with narcotics distribution networks. Every element of the probable cause was either fabricated, mischaracterized, or based on evidence that Coulter himself had manufactured. But the warrant was signed. And at 8:44 a.m., a two-person team from the sheriff's office arrived at Birchwood Lane with the warrant folded in a jacket pocket and a forensics kit in the trunk. They knocked on the door. No answer. They entered using a key obtained from Henderson Realty's emergency lockbox. Inside, they found exactly what Coulter had expected: a sparse residence, minimal personal effects, the sterile organization of a man who hadn't settled in. The laptop on the kitchen table was password protected. The drawers contained nothing remarkable. The bedroom closet held plain clothes and no documents. Then one of the officers checked the car in the driveway. The Ford Taurus was unlocked. Terrance had left it unlocked because locking it would have required his keys, which were in the station's property bag. Under the passenger seat, they found the briefcase, black leather, combination lock, and on the side facing up, a sticker that neither officer had seen before outside of a federal building. Property of the United States government, Federal Bureau of Investigation, unauthorized access prohibited. 18 U.S.C. Section 793. The officer, holding the briefcase, set it down. Slowly. The way you set down something that has just changed the temperature of everything around it. He pulled out his phone, called Coulter. "Detective, you're going to want to come to Birchwood Lane. Right now." 23 minutes later, 9:07 a.m., 2 minutes before Terrance's bond hearing was scheduled to begin, Coulter stood in the living room of 4712 Birchwood Lane, staring at a briefcase he couldn't open, a sticker he couldn't explain, and the growing realization that the man in his interrogation room was not an IT consultant. And in the substation on Holloway Road, Janelle Morse sat in her cruiser in the back lot, engine off, hands shaking, staring at a text message on her personal phone. A message from a number she recognized, routed through the same relay system she used to communicate with her handler. The message was 2 words. Cover blown. She didn't know whose cover. Hers, Terrance's, both. The message didn't specify, and the relay system didn't allow replies. She looked at the station entrance, looked at the phone, looked at the USB drive in her jacket pocket, the drive that contained 6 months of internal communications, the drive that had been meant for the mailbox on Birchwood Lane, the drive that now sat in the pocket of a cooperating witness who didn't know whether she was about to be exposed as a federal informant inside the department that employed her. Morse put the phone down, took a breath, made a decision. She opened the car door, stepped out into the morning sun, and walked back into the station. Because some decisions aren't about safety, they're about what you can live with if you drive away. The sticker on the briefcase was small, 3 inches by 2, government issue adhesive, the kind that didn't peel off clean. Black text on white backing, block letters that carried the weight of federal statute and the implicit promise that whatever was inside this case existed under protections that a county detective's search warrant did not override. Property of the United States government. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Unauthorized access prohibited. 18 U.S.C. Section 793. Coulter stood in the living room of 4712 Birchwood Lane, holding his phone against his ear, waiting for Taggart to pick up. The 2 officers who'd executed the warrant, Deputies Kelso and Brandt, stood near the car, not touching the briefcase anymore, their postures communicating the particular discomfort of men who'd reached into a bag expecting a rabbit and found something with teeth. Taggart answered on the 5th ring, the voice of a man dragged into his second unwelcome conversation before 9 a.m. "What?" "We've got a problem at the Birchwood address." Coulter kept his voice level, but the pacing was wrong, too fast, syllables compressed, the verbal signature of controlled panic. "Search team found a briefcase in the subject's vehicle. It's tagged as FBI property." Silence. 3 seconds of it. Then Taggart's voice dropped into the register he used when things moved from manageable to institutional. "Tagged how?" "Federal property sticker. Standard government issue. 18 U.S.C. 793 citation. That's the Espionage Act provision for unauthorized access to classified materials." "I know what 793 is." The irritation in Taggart's voice was real, but underneath it was something harder to name. Calculation. The rapid mental arithmetic of a man determining whether a situation could be contained or whether it had already escaped containment. "Did you open it?" "Combination lock. We didn't attempt access." "Good. Don't. Don't touch it. Don't move it. Don't photograph it. Put both deputies outside the house and seal the door. Nobody goes back in until I get there. Neil. Coulter's use of the first name was deliberate, a signal that this conversation had moved past professional and into the territory where careers were at stake. If this guy is Bureau, we've got an agent in our holding cell on a fabricated obstruction charge with a planted pill bottle in his property bag. That's not a complaint. That's a federal indictment. The line was quiet for 4 seconds. Hearing's at 9, Taggart said finally. I'm en route to the station now. We need to get in front of this before anything happens in that courtroom. What does getting in front of it look like? It looks like dropping all charges and releasing him before anyone with a GS pay grade shows up with a warrant. And the pill bottle? Taggart's answer came without hesitation, which told Coulter everything about how the deputy chief's moral architecture was organized. The pill bottle was a field test error. Preliminary analysis was inconclusive. Upon further review, the substance was determined to be over-the-counter medication. The supplemental inventory is rescinded. That doesn't fix the booking record, the timestamp discrepancy, the body cam. Raymond, Taggart's voice cut clean. Stop talking. Drive back to the station. Be there before 9. And if you speak to anyone about what was found in that house, anyone, you'll need a lawyer before lunch. The line went dead. Coulter stood in the empty living room. Around him, the sparse evidence of a man who had been living 2 lives, the surface life of an IT consultant and the operative life of something else entirely. The laptop on the kitchen table, which forensics would not be touching now. The ring camera on the porch, which had been recording everything since the moment Terrance moved in. The neat, deliberate organization of a residence that was less a home than a staging area. He thought about the pill bottle, about the 63 seconds of body cam footage he'd overwritten at 2:37 a.m. from his desk terminal, replacing the initial approach video with a corrupted file that would register as a technical malfunction during any routine audit. About the arrest report he'd encouraged Fitch to embellish, the jacket that didn't exist, the furtive movements that never happened. About the 16 other times he'd done some version of this, the 16 other people who'd sat in that holding cell while evidence was manufactured around them like scaffolding. 16 times, and it had worked. 16 clean outcomes. 16 cases where the system absorbed the fabrication and moved on, where complaints were filed and ignored, where public defenders raised objections that nobody sustained. And now, the 17th subject was FBI. Coulter locked the front door of 4712 Birchwood Lane, told Kelso and Brandt to maintain the perimeter, got in his car, sat behind the wheel for 30 seconds without starting the engine, staring at the steering wheel like it contained answers. Then he drove, fast, back toward the station on Holloway Road, where a hearing was about to begin, and a man who knew everything was sitting in an interrogation room waiting for a magistrate who knew nothing. 9:03 a.m. Courtroom B, which wasn't a courtroom at all, just a converted conference room with a folding table, mismatched chairs, and a laptop connected to the county court system. The magistrate, a woman named Phyllis Chow, sat behind the table with reading glasses balanced on the bridge of her nose and a docket printout that listed 7 bond hearings before lunch. The room smelled like burnt coffee and carpet adhesive. Ostrowski was already seated at the defense table, a second folding table positioned 4 feet from the magistrate's. Her 3 file folders were arranged in order. Her legal pad showed a full page of handwritten notes from the morning. She wore the same clothes from her 4 a.m. visit to the holding cell, which meant she hadn't gone home. She'd spent the intervening hours in the courthouse library, pulling case law and preparing a motion that she intended to deliver with the precision of a person who understood that magistrate hearings lasted 6 minutes on average, and you had to make every sentence count. Terrance was brought in by Hewitt. No handcuffs. Ostrowski had filed a pretrial motion requesting their removal during the hearing, citing the visible wrist injuries as evidence of excessive restraint. The magistrate had granted it without comment, which was either a good sign or simply the path of least paperwork. He sat beside Ostrowski. She slid a single sheet of paper toward him, a summary of the motion she was about to present, organized in bullet points with statute citations in the margins. Follow my lead, she whispered. If the magistrate asks you a direct question, answer with facts only. No argument, no legal analysis. Let me do the arguing. The prosecution side of the room was empty for the first 40 seconds. Then the door opened and a man Terrance hadn't seen before entered. Mid-30s, county attorney's office badge, the slightly rushed demeanor of a prosecutor who'd been handed a file 10 minutes ago and was still reading it. Matthew Ingram, assistant district attorney, for the state. He settled into his chair and opened the folder. His eyebrows rose as he read, which was not the expression of a man who liked what he was seeing. Magistrate Chow looked at the docket. State versus Calloway. Charges: obstruction of a law enforcement officer, North Carolina General Statute 14-223, and possession of a controlled substance. Schedule 2, General Statute 90-95. Mr. Ingram, is the state prepared? The state is prepared, Your Honor. We request continued detention and standard bond. Your Honor. Ostrowski stood. Defense has filed an emergency motion for immediate release with prejudice, and I'd ask the court's permission to present grounds before bond is addressed. Chow looked at Ingram. Ingram looked at his file, which clearly did not contain anything about a defense motion filed that morning. I haven't received. Filed at 7:51 a.m. with the clerk's office. Copies provided to the ADA's mailbox at 8:05. Ostrowski handed a physical copy across the gap between tables. The motion identifies 4 independent grounds for dismissal. Chow nodded. Proceed, Ms. Ostrowski. Thank you, Your Honor. Ground 1. The arrest report filed by Officer Leon Fitch, badge 2241, describes a pat-down search based on the officer observing the defendant making, quote, furtive movements consistent with concealing an object in his right jacket pocket, end quote. She paused. The defendant was not wearing a jacket. The property inventory completed at booking lists a t-shirt, jeans, and shoes. No jacket was recovered, photographed, or referenced at any point during processing. Ingram's pen stopped moving. The officer's stated probable cause for the pat-down is based on an article of clothing that did not exist. This renders the search unlawful under Terry v. Ohio, and the entirety of the subsequent detention, including all evidence obtained, is subject to suppression. Chow wrote a note. Ground 2. Ground 2. The dispatch log shows Mrs. Diana Prescott's 911 call was received at 10:08 p.m. The arrest report lists the time of arrest as 10:31 p.m. However, the drive time from the closest patrol position to the defendant's address is 12 minutes minimum. Officer Fitch would have had 4 minutes to respond, make contact, assess the situation, and effect an arrest, an impossibility that suggests either the arrest time is falsified or the officer was pre-positioned at the location before the call was dispatched. Ingram shifted in his chair. He was reading fast now, flipping through pages he hadn't reviewed. Ground 3. The controlled substance charge is based on a prescription bottle that appeared in the defendant's property bag during a secondary inventory conducted at approximately 12:15 a.m., 90 minutes after the initial booking sealed the bag. The defendant declined to sign the supplemental inventory form and verbally documented the discrepancy in the presence of Officer Hewitt. The chain of custody was broken when the sealed bag was opened without the defendant present and without supervisory authorization. And Ground 4? Ostrowski opened the third folder, placed the body cam activity log on the table, oriented so both the magistrate and Ingram could read it. Ground 4. Officer Fitch's body cam footage was subject to a partial overwrite at 2:37 a.m., initiated from Terminal D, A-admin-04, a Detective Division desktop. 63 seconds of footage from the beginning of the recording, the initial approach and contact, were replaced with a corrupted file. The only detective present in the station at that hour, based on the building's access logs, was Detective Raymond Coulter. The room went quiet. The particular quiet of a legal proceeding in which every person present has simultaneously realized that the case in front of them is larger than the room it's sitting in. Chow removed her glasses, set them on the table, looked at Ingram. Mr. Ingram, does the state have a response? Ingram closed his folder. The gesture was slow, deliberate. The body language of a prosecutor making a real-time decision about whether to defend a case that had just been disassembled in front of him, or step back and let the debris fall on the people who'd built it. Your Honor, the state requests a 15-minute recess to confer with the arresting agency. You have 10. If this story already has you on the edge of your seat, hit that subscribe button now, because what walks through that door next changes everything. Ingram left the room. Ostrowski sat down. Terrance exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. That was, "Don't celebrate yet." Ostrowski's voice was low, professional, calibrated for the room's acoustics. Ingram has two options: drop the charges or ask for a continuance to investigate. If he drops them, you walk. If he asks for time, the magistrate can grant up to 72 hours and you stay in custody. Coulter won't let him drop the charges. Coulter doesn't get a vote. The ADA makes charging decisions. That's separation of powers. In theory. She looked at him, the look of a lawyer who appreciated clients who understood how systems actually worked versus how they were supposed to work. 7 minutes into the 10-minute recess, the door opened. Not Ingram. Not Coulter. Not anyone Terrance expected. 3 people entered courtroom B. 2 men and a woman, all in dark suits, all carrying credentials that caught the overhead fluorescent light. The lead figure, a woman in her late 40s, black, close-cropped hair, an expression that combined authority with the particular controlled intensity of someone who had driven very fast to get here, walked directly to the magistrate's table and held up an identification wallet. Your Honor, Supervisory Special Agent Denise Radford, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Raleigh Field Office. Her voice filled the converted conference room the way a church organ fills a chapel, not by volume, but by weight. I'm here regarding the defendant in this proceeding. Chow's eyebrows rose. She examined the credentials, looked at Radford, looked at the 2 agents flanking her, one positioned near the door, one moving to the prosecution table where Ingram's empty chair sat like an accusation. Agent Radford, this is a county magistrate hearing, unless you're here as a witness. I'm here to inform the court that the defendant, Terrance Calloway, is a special agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation assigned to the Public Corruption Unit at the Raleigh Field Office. Radford placed a manila folder on the magistrate's table. His presence in Durham County is part of an active federal investigation. His arrest last night by officers of the Durham County Sheriff's Office was unlawful, and his continued detention constitutes interference with a federal operation. The room recalibrated. Every person in it, Chow, Ostrowski, Hewitt, standing by the door, the court clerk in the corner, processed the information at different speeds, arriving at the same destination through different cognitive paths. Terrance Calloway was not an IT consultant. He was FBI. And every person who had touched his case in the last 11 hours had, in the precise language of federal statute, deprived a federal officer of his civil rights under color of law. Chow put her glasses back on. Read the contents of the folder Radford had placed in front of her. 2 pages. Credentials verification. Field office authorization letter. Case number, redacted, but present, confirming the existence of an active investigation without revealing its scope. Agent Radford, is the defendant willing to confirm his identity? Radford looked at Terrance. A nod. Not of permission, but of acknowledgement. The signal that the cover was officially burned and the operational decision had been made. Terrance stood. Terrance James Calloway, Special Agent, Federal Bureau of Investigation, badge number 7418, assigned to the Public Corruption Unit, Raleigh Field Office, since March of last year. I've been operating in Durham County undercover for the past 3 weeks as part of case number RC-24-0917. He paused. Let the badge number hang in the air, the way badge numbers do when they change the architecture of a room. The case involves a pattern or practice investigation of the Durham County Sheriff's Office, focusing on civil asset forfeiture abuse, evidence fabrication, and deprivation of civil rights under color of law. Title 18, United States Code, Section 242. Ostrowski's pen was frozen above her legal pad. She was staring at Terrance with the expression of a person who had just discovered that the client she'd been defending for 5 hours was the answer to 4 years of her own unanswered reports. Your Honor, your C. Radford stepped forward. I'm requesting immediate release of Agent Calloway. I'm also notifying the court that the FBI will be filing a formal complaint with the North Carolina Attorney General's office regarding the conduct of the arresting officers, and we will be seeking preservation orders for all evidence related to Agent Calloway's detention, including body cam footage, booking records, property inventory logs, and building access records. Chow looked at the folder, looked at Terrance, looked at the empty prosecution chair. Where is Mr. Ingram? The door opened again, as if summoned by the question. Ingram entered, saw the 3 FBI agents, and stopped in the doorway with the frozen posture of a man who had walked into a room expecting a chess game and found a controlled demolition. Mr. Ingram? Chow's voice carried the precise neutrality of a judicial officer who had decided to let the record speak for itself. The FBI has informed this court that the defendant is a federal agent operating undercover. Do you wish to proceed with the charges? Ingram looked at the agents, looked at Terrance, looked at the folder on the magistrate's table. Then he did the only thing a prosecutor with functioning survival instincts could do. Your Honor, the state moves to dismiss all charges against the defendant, without prejudice. Without prejudice means the state reserves the right to refile. Given the circumstances, I'm inclined to dismiss with prejudice. Chow's pen moved across the docket. Charges dismissed. Defendant is released immediately. All property to be returned. Court is in recess. She banged the table once. No gavel, just her palm, flat and final. Terrance stood. The room rearranged itself around him. Hewitt unlocked the door and stepped aside. Ostrowski gathered her files, her hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the particular adrenaline that came with realizing you'd been standing on the right side of something much larger than you'd understood. Radford approached, extended her hand. The gesture was professional, but her eyes communicated something warmer. The particular relief of a handler whose operative had survived a night that could have ended very differently. Agent Calloway, let's get you out of here. My house is a crime scene. We know. Our team secured it 20 minutes ago. Coulter's warrant has been challenged. We filed an emergency motion with the Federal District Court as soon as we confirmed the search. Judge Aidan Park in the Eastern District signed an order sealing everything recovered from the premises. The briefcase? Still in your car, untouched. We have custody of the vehicle. They walked through the corridor, past the booking desk, where the day shift sergeant watched 3 FBI agents escort a man he'd processed as a criminal 12 hours ago. Past the interrogation room, door open, the spilled coffee stain still visible on the metal table. Past the holding cell where Terrance had spent the night cataloging evidence in his head while the building slept around him. At the station's front entrance, Terrance paused. The parking lot was different. 2 black Suburbans sat angled across the visitor spaces, federal plates catching morning light. A third vehicle, unmarked sedan, tinted windows, idled near the sally port. Agents moved between vehicles in the building with the coordinated efficiency of a team executing a planned operation, and standing beside the lead Suburban, holding a tablet computer and speaking rapidly into a phone, was a man Terrance recognized from the Raleigh office. ASAC, Terrance Okafor, the assistant special agent in charge who oversaw all civil rights investigations in the Eastern North Carolina district. Okafor's presence meant this had escalated beyond field office level. Someone in Washington had been briefed. Someone above Radford had authorized the response. Okafor ended his call, approached. Agent Calloway. No handshake. The acknowledgement was professional, clipped, the tone of a man who was already thinking 3 moves ahead. We've notified the United States Attorney's Office. A federal grand jury subpoena is being prepared for Officer Fitch, Detective Coulter, and Deputy Chief Taggart. Evidence preservation orders have been issued to the Durham County Sheriff's Office, the County IT Department, and the Emergency Dispatch Center. Morse. The name landed between them. Okafor's expression didn't change, but Radford's did, a tightening around the eyes that communicated both awareness and concern. "Officer Morse is our priority," Radford said. "She's currently inside the station. We've made contact through the relay system. She's been instructed to maintain position until we can extract her safely. She has the USB, 6 months of internal communications. If Coulter or Taggart find that drive, they won't." Radford's voice carried certainty that was either well-founded or well-performed. "We have a plan, but it requires you to not be here when it happens." Terrance looked at the station, looked at the door he'd just walked through. Somewhere inside that building, Janelle Morse was sitting in a cruiser or standing by a desk or filing a report, carrying evidence in her pocket that could end careers and begin federal prosecutions, waiting for a signal that might or might not come before someone realized what she was carrying. He got in the Suburban. Radford got in beside him. The vehicle pulled out of the parking lot and turned east toward Raleigh, toward the field office, toward the debriefing that would last for hours, and the decisions that would determine how the next 6 months unfolded. Behind them, the Holloway Road substation shrank in the side mirror, getting smaller, getting quieter, but not yet finished. The debriefing at the Raleigh field office began at 11:40 a.m. and lasted until 4 the following morning. Conference room 3-C. No windows. 1 long table, 6 chairs, a recording device in the center, red light steady, Radford across the table, Okafor at the head, 2 analysts from the Civil Rights Unit flanking them, laptops open, cross-referencing every detail Terrance provided against the 14 months of existing case documentation. Terrance spoke for 9 hours. Not continuously. There were breaks for water, for food that arrived in cardboard containers from a deli 3 blocks away, for the moments when exhaustion pressed against his discipline, and his voice went flat enough that Radford called a pause. But 9 hours of substantive testimony, covering everything from the night Diana Prescott first knocked on his door with banana bread and a clipboard, to the moment Coulter's hand grabbed his collar in the interrogation room. Every officer named, every timestamp recorded, every statute violated, cataloged with the kind of precision that came from spending a night in a concrete cell with nothing to do but build the architecture of accountability inside his own head. The body cam overwrite, the planted pill bottle, the fabricated jacket in Fitch's arrest report, the timestamp discrepancy that Ostrowski had identified, the 4-minute impossibility that suggested pre-positioning, Taggart's midnight visit and the decision to extend detention despite his own sergeant questioning the arrest, Coulter's interrogation techniques, his knowledge of the burner phone and the ring camera, his escalation to felony charges based on evidence he'd manufactured, and the search warrant. The warrant that Coulter had obtained at 8:31 a.m. from a county magistrate, based on probable cause built entirely from fabricated or mischaracterized evidence, then executed at a residence that turned out to be an FBI cover house. "That warrant is the cornerstone," Okafor said, making a note on his tablet. Coulter signed the affidavit. The magistrate signed the warrant. "If we can show the affidavit contained knowing falsehoods, the pill bottle as probable cause, the phone as evidence of drug activity, we've got Franks versus Delaware. Intentional misrepresentation in a warrant application." "The pill bottle's lot number," Terrance said. "If forensics can trace that bottle to the station's evidence inventory, if the pills came from a seizure Coulter processed, that's not just a fabrication. That's theft from evidence and distribution under color of law." Radford wrote something in her notepad, underlined it twice. At 1:30 a.m., a knock on the conference room door. An analyst entered carrying a tablet, face tight with the controlled urgency of someone delivering information that couldn't wait. "Morse is out." The room exhaled. "Extraction happened at 6:40 p.m., the analyst continued. "She completed her shift, drove to the designated safe house in Chapel Hill, and surrendered the USB drive to Agent Pryor." He set the tablet on the table, screen showing a file transfer confirmation. "Contents are uploading to the secure server now. Initial scan shows approximately 1,400 internal emails, 200 shift scheduling logs, and a complete mirror of the Internal Affairs complaint database, both the public version and the administrative version. Both versions, Radford repeated. The words hung in the air with the weight of something that had been pursued for over a year and had finally materialized. The Internal Affairs database, the real one, the one that showed how complaints were reclassified from excessive force to procedural inquiry and then closed without investigation, was the structural evidence that would transform the case from a collection of individual incidents into a pattern or practice prosecution under 34 U.S.C. Section 12601. Morse's status? Terrance asked. Relocated. Safe house in Raleigh. She submitted her resignation from the Durham County Sheriff's Office by email at 7:15 p.m., effective immediately, citing personal reasons. By the time anyone in the department reads it, she'll be in federal protective custody. Terrance sat with that for a moment. Resignation. 3 years of Morse's career. The academy, the field training, the slow accumulation of trust within a department she'd come to understand was corrupt, reduced to an email citing personal reasons. The cost of cooperation, measured in a career that ended not with a commendation, but with a one-paragraph resignation nobody would question because they'd already stopped paying attention to the quiet young officer who filed reports nobody read. She'll be called to testify, Okafor said. Grand jury, possibly trial. She needs to understand that. She understands. Terrance's voice was flat. Not cold, exhausted. The exhaustion of a man who had spent a night on a concrete bench and a day in a conference room and still had hours of testimony ahead. She understood before she agreed to cooperate. She understood when she walked back into the station this morning after getting the cover-blown message. She made her choice. The debriefing continued. 3 more hours. Every detail extracted, verified, cross-referenced, cataloged. By 4 a.m. Saturday, the case file had grown by 47 pages. The evidence matrix, a spreadsheet tracking charges, defendants, statutes, evidence, and witnesses, had expanded to include 3 new names and 2 new categories of violation. Terrance slept for 6 hours on a cot in an unused office on the field office's 3rd floor. Not by choice, Radford ordered it. His body complied even though his mind kept running, kept replaying the moments, kept calculating exposure and consequence and the distance between where he was and where Morse was, and where Coulter was, and whether any of them were safe. He dreamed about the porch, the swing, the coffee, the flashlight beam that turned his world sideways. In the dream, the beam didn't stop. It expanded, filling the porch, filling the yard, filling the street, turning everything white and shadowless, until the only dark thing left was the knee pressed into his back. He woke at 10 a.m., showered in the field office locker room, put on clean clothes from a go-bag Radford had retrieved from the Chapel Hill safe house, drank 2 cups of coffee that tasted like they'd been made by a machine that had never been cleaned and never would be. At noon, he sat in Okafor's office and watched the press conference on a wall-mounted monitor. United States Attorney Claudia Fenn stood behind a podium at the federal courthouse in Raleigh. Mid-50s, white, the kind of lawyer who'd prosecuted organized crime before pivoting to civil rights enforcement and brought the same zero-tolerance energy to both. Flanking her were Radford and a Department of Justice representative from Washington, whose presence signaled that this case had attracted attention at the national level. This morning, the United States Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of North Carolina filed a civil rights complaint against the Durham County Sheriff's Office under Title 34, United States Code, Section 12601, the pattern or practice statute. Fenn's voice was measured, calibrated for cameras, but the content hit with force. This complaint is the result of a 14-month federal investigation into allegations of excessive force, evidence fabrication, civil asset forfeiture abuse, and systematic deprivation of constitutional rights. She paused. Cameras clicked. Reporters shifted. In connection with this investigation, federal arrest warrants have been issued for 3 members of the Durham County Sheriff's Office. Officer Leon Fitch, badge number 2241, is charged with deprivation of rights under color of law, Title 18, United States Code, Section 242, and with filing a false police report. Detective Raymond Coulter is charged with evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, deprivation of rights under color of law, and falsification of records in a federal investigation under Title 18, Section 1519. Deputy Chief Neil Taggart is charged with obstruction of justice and conspiracy to deprive rights under color of law. The courtroom gallery, packed with reporters, community members, and a handful of sheriff's deputies who'd come to see the announcement for themselves, reacted with the particular murmur that follows news everyone expected, but nobody was fully prepared to hear. These charges stem from specific incidents, including the unlawful arrest and detention of a federal agent operating in an authorized undercover capacity, the fabrication of evidence to justify continued detention, the deliberate overwriting of body cam footage to conceal officer misconduct, and the execution of a search warrant based on an affidavit containing knowing falsehoods. Fenn looked directly at the cameras. No law enforcement officer, regardless of rank, tenure, or jurisdiction, is above the law they've sworn to uphold. When officers fabricate evidence, destroy recordings, and target citizens based on the color of their skin, they are not protecting their communities. They are betraying them. This is just the beginning of the fallout. Hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The arrests happen simultaneously. 3 teams, 3 locations, coordinated to prevent communication between subjects. Fitch was taken at his apartment in South Durham at 11:45 a.m., still in bed, still wearing the same clothes from his shift the night before. The agents who served the warrant described him as cooperative, a word that took on a particular irony given the circumstances. He said nothing during transport. His union representative met him at the federal courthouse, looked at the charging documents, and excused herself to make a phone call that lasted 20 minutes. Coulter was arrested at the Holloway Road substation at 11:47 a.m. in the middle of a phone call that he ended abruptly when he saw the federal agents entering through the sally port. He attempted to access his desk computer before being stopped, an action that was noted in the arrest report and would later be cited as potential evidence of attempted destruction. His desk was sealed. His personal phone was seized under the warrant. His department-issued laptop was tagged and bagged by an FBI digital forensics specialist who handled it with the careful reverence of someone who knew exactly what it contained and what it was worth. Taggart was the most complex. He was arrested at the Durham County Administrative Building at 11:50 a.m. during a meeting with the county attorney that he'd requested 30 minutes earlier, presumably to get ahead of whatever was coming. The county attorney, whose office would normally represent the sheriff's department in civil matters, immediately recused herself upon seeing the federal warrants. Taggart was escorted out of the building through a side entrance, but someone with a phone camera caught 20 seconds of footage from a second-floor window, a deputy chief in handcuffs, walking between 2 federal agents, his head down, his career ending in the same parking lot where he'd parked his car that morning, expecting a normal day. The footage was online within the hour, shared 40,000 times by evening. Inside the Holloway Road substation, the mood was a particular kind of chaos. Not the loud, reactive chaos of an emergency, but the quiet, corroding chaos of an institution realizing that its foundation was rotten. Deputies who'd worked alongside Fitch and Coulter for years stood at their desks, talking in low voices, calibrating their own exposure. Who had signed off on reports they hadn't read? Who had been present during booking irregularities they hadn't questioned? Who had heard rumors about the evidence room, about the forfeiture accounts, about the way certain cases were handled differently based on the subject's appearance? The sheriff, Ben Rawlings, 61, 34 years in law enforcement, 18 months from a pension that would fund the rest of his natural life, held a staff meeting at 2 p.m. Attendance mandatory. The conference room was standing room only, and the air was thick with the particular humidity that comes from 40 people breathing anxiety into a room designed for 20. I want to be clear about several things. Rawlings stood at the front, no podium, hands clasped behind his back in the posture of a man who'd learned public speaking in the military and never updated the technique. The actions described in the federal complaint do not represent this department. They represent individual failures by individuals who will be held accountable through the legal process. Isolated incident. Individual failures. The first line of institutional defense deployed so reflexively that it might as well have been printed on a card and read aloud. Effective immediately, all officers involved in the incidents described in the complaint are suspended with pay pending the outcome of the investigation. All body camera footage from the past 6 months will be subject to a department-wide audit, and I've requested an independent review of our internal affairs processes by the North Carolina Attorney General's office. Suspended with pay, not fired, not charged internally, suspended, the administrative equivalent of being sent to your room while the adults decided what to do. The union contract required it, the political calculus demanded it, and the practical effect was that Fitch, Coulter, and Taggart would continue receiving their salaries while the federal case against them wound through a process that would take months, possibly years. Someone in the back of the room, Terrance would later learn it was a patrol deputy named Faulkner who'd been on the force for 11 years and had never filed a complaint about anything, raised his hand. "Sheriff, how long have the feds been watching us?" Rawlings's jaw tightened. "That's a question for the FBI, not for me." 14 months. The voice came from the doorway. Heads turned. A woman stood there. Slight build, civilian clothes, no badge, no gun, no authority except the kind that came from having spent 3 years inside a building pretending to be someone she wasn't. Janelle Morse had come back. Not to the station, physically. She was watching the press conference from the Raleigh safe house, connected to the building's conference room through a secure video feed that Radford had arranged at Terrance's request. But her image appeared on the large screen at the front of the room, and her voice came through the speakers with the clarity of a woman who had spent 3 years biting her tongue and had decided, in this moment, to stop. 14 months. Agent Calloway was on the ground for 3 weeks, but the investigation started long before he arrived. It started because I filed a complaint about evidence being moved from the seizure locker to Officer Fitch's personal vehicle, and my supervisor shredded the complaint form in front of me. The room went very quiet. I watched. Morse's voice was steady, but there was a fracture running through it, the particular vibration of someone who was holding herself together through will rather than comfort. For 3 years I watched reports get rewritten. I watched body cam footage disappear. I watched people get booked on charges that were manufactured after the arrest, not before. I watched Detective Coulter add items to property bags after sealing, and I watched Sergeant Barrick sign off on booking forms he knew were falsified. She paused. The silence in the conference room was absolute. I reported it. I used the internal system. I filed 4 separate complaints through IA. Every single one was closed within 72 hours with a finding of unsubstantiated, not investigated, not reviewed, closed. Because the system that was supposed to catch the misconduct was controlled by the same people committing it. Rawlings stood at the front of the room, his face an architecture of competing calculations, the professional assessment of a man who'd just been publicly contradicted by a subordinate he'd never suspected. The political awareness of an elected official watching his re-election prospects evaporate in real time, and underneath both, something that might have been the recognition that the institution he'd spent his career building had been rotting from the inside while he signed reports and planned for retirement. "Officer Morse," he began, "former Officer Morse." The correction was quiet but final. "I resigned yesterday, and everything I've described is documented. 1,400 emails, 200 scheduling logs, the complete IA database, both versions. The version the public sees, and the version that shows what actually happened to complaints." The screen went dark. Morse had disconnected. The conference room remained silent for 8 seconds, long enough for every person in it to understand that the department they worked for was about to be turned inside out, and that the process had been set in motion not by the FBI, not by the courts, but by a 26-year-old patrol officer who had tried to fix the problem from the inside, and when that failed, had carried the evidence out in her jacket pocket. The weeks that followed moved with the grinding, procedural slowness that characterized federal civil rights investigations, a pace that frustrated the public, reassured defense attorneys, and exhausted the prosecutors, who had to build cases that would survive years of appeals. The federal grand jury convened 9 days after the arrests. 23 citizens of the Eastern District of North Carolina, selected from voter rolls and DMV records, seated in a room at the federal courthouse that smelled like old carpet and filtered air. They heard testimony for 6 days, over 3 weeks. Terrance was the lead witness, testifying for 11 hours across 2 sessions, walking the grand jury through every element of the investigation: the 14 months of preparation, the 3 weeks of cover residence, the night of the arrest, and the morning after. Ostrowski testified for 3 hours. She brought her files: 4 years of documentation, 67 flagged bookings, a spreadsheet tracking timestamp discrepancies that she'd maintained on her personal computer because the county system didn't have a function for tracking irregularities. The grand jury foreman asked her why she'd kept filing reports that went nowhere. "Because documentation is evidence," she said, "even when nobody's reading it. Eventually someone reads it." Morse testified remotely, by video link, from a location the court did not disclose. Her testimony was narrower, focused on the internal affairs complaints she'd filed and the specific instances of evidence tampering she'd witnessed. She identified Coulter by name in 7 separate incidents. She identified Fitch in 4. She identified Barrick, the booking sergeant who had questioned Fitch's arrest and then processed it anyway, in 11. Barrick was not charged. The grand jury considered his case and declined to indict, concluding that processing a booking he believed was flawed, while ethically questionable, did not rise to the level of criminal conspiracy. Barrick was, however, named as a subject of the Department of Justice's pattern or practice investigation, and his personnel file was flagged for administrative review. The grand jury returned indictments on all 3 primary subjects. Fitch was indicted on 4 counts: deprivation of rights under color of law, filing a false police report, assault under color of law, and conspiracy. Coulter was indicted on 6 counts: evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, deprivation of rights under color of law, falsification of records in a federal investigation, perjury in a warrant application, and conspiracy. Taggart was indicted on 3 counts: obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and misprision of felony, the rarely charged offense of knowing about a federal crime and failing to report it. The indictments were unsealed on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, 6 weeks after the arrest on Birchwood Lane. By then, the case had attracted national attention, not because a federal agent had been wrongfully arrested, which happened more often than the Bureau liked to acknowledge, but because the institutional response had been so thoroughly documented. The Ring camera footage, the body cam overwrite log, the twin IA databases, the timestamp discrepancy, the planted pill bottle. Every layer of the cover-up had been peeled back and preserved, creating a public record that was impossible to spin and difficult to dismiss. Diana Prescott was not indicted. The federal investigation examined her 911 call and her next-door posts, but concluded that, while her actions were racially motivated, they did not rise to the level of federal criminal conduct. Making a false police report was a state misdemeanor under North Carolina General Statute Section 14-225, and the Durham County District Attorney's Office, under public pressure, filed the charge in June. Prescott retained a private attorney, pleaded no contest, and was sentenced to 12 months of unsupervised probation and a $300 fine. She did not move out of Colton Ridge. She did resign from the HOA board, which elected a new president who immediately disbanded the Neighborhood Watch program. The pattern or practice investigation continued on a parallel track, moving with the particular deliberation of a process that was designed to reform institutions rather than punish individuals. The DOJ appointed a team of 3 investigators who spent 4 months reviewing the Durham County Sheriff's Office, its policies, training protocols, complaint handling procedures, use of force reports, and the civil asset forfeiture program that had generated over $2.3 million in revenue over 3 years with minimal judicial oversight. Their preliminary findings, released in September, ran to 112 pages. The executive summary used language that was, by DOJ standards, unusually direct. The Durham County Sheriff's Office has engaged in a pattern or practice of conduct that deprives persons of rights, privileges, or immunities secured or protected by the Constitution or laws of the United States. This pattern includes, but is not limited to, racially discriminatory enforcement practices concentrated in traffic stops and pedestrian encounters, systematic failure to investigate complaints of officer misconduct, evidence handling procedures that permitted tampering without detection, and a forfeiture program operated without adequate oversight or accountability. The report recommended a federal consent decree, a court-supervised reform agreement that would require the department to implement specific changes over a period of 5 years, with progress monitored by an independent compliance team. The consent decree negotiations began in October and were expected to last 6 to 12 months. Expected, not guaranteed. Because consent decrees required the cooperation of the department being reformed, and cooperation was a commodity that institutions under investigation dispensed sparingly. Sheriff Rawlings announced his retirement in August, effective January 1st of the following year. His statement cited personal reasons and the desire to spend time with family, the standard language of a departure that was voluntary in name and forced in everything else. The county commission appointed an interim sheriff, a captain from the department's training division who had no connection to the corruption cases and whose primary qualification appeared to be the absence of disqualifying connections. Whether the interim sheriff would cooperate with the consent decree, implement genuine reform, or simply wait for the political pressure to subside, that remained to be seen. Institutional change required sustained attention, and sustained attention was the one resource that public outrage reliably failed to provide. The community response divided along lines that were predictable but no less painful for their predictability. Within 48 hours of the press conference, 3 separate demonstrations materialized in downtown Durham, one organized by the local NAACP chapter, one by a coalition of community organizations that had been tracking police misconduct for years, and one, smaller, by a group of law enforcement families who carried signs reading "Back the Blue" and "Isolated Incident" and shouted at passing cars with the particular fervor of people who believed that defending institutions required ignoring the evidence against them. The city council held an emergency session on the second Tuesday after the arrests. The chamber was packed. Speakers were given 3 minutes each. The line extended out the door and down the hallway, wrapping around the building's central staircase like a living timeline of grievances that had been accumulating for years, waiting for the moment when someone in authority was forced to listen. A man named Trevon Okafor, no relation to the ASAC, stood at the microphone and described being stopped on Route 70 in January of the previous year. Cash seized. Charges never filed. Vehicle impounded for 3 weeks. The impound fee cost him $800 he didn't have, and he'd lost his delivery job because he couldn't make his shifts. He'd filed a complaint. The complaint was closed in 4 days. A woman named Sandra Polk described her son's arrest outside a convenience store on Roxborough Road, charged with resisting, a charge that was dropped when bystander video showed her son standing motionless with his hands visible while an officer applied a chokehold. The officer received a written reprimand. Her son received a medical bill for a cracked hyoid bone. A retired teacher named Constance Avery described 31 years of living in Durham and watching the relationship between the police department and the black community deteriorate from cautious distance to active hostility. She didn't shout, didn't cry, just spoke in the measured cadence of a woman who had been saying the same things for decades and had stopped expecting anyone to act on them. "You're surprised because the FBI found it," she said, looking directly at the council members. "We're not surprised. We've been telling you. You weren't listening." The council voted unanimously to support the consent decree process and to allocate funding for an independent civilian review board with subpoena power. The vote was symbolic. The actual implementation would require negotiations with the sheriff's office, the police union, the county attorney, and the state legislature, each of which had its own interests, timelines, and capacity for obstruction. But the vote happened. The record showed it. The minutes documented it. And for the people who had waited in line for 3 hours to speak for 3 minutes, the documentation mattered. Not because it guaranteed change, but because it made denial more difficult. Terrance watched the council session from his apartment that evening, streaming it on his laptop while eating takeout that had gone cold an hour ago. He recognized several of the speakers, names from the case file, people whose complaints had been among the 1,600 in the IA database, people who had been telling the truth for years to a system that had perfected the art of listening without hearing. Morse called him that night. It was the 3rd time they'd spoken since her relocation, and each conversation had carried the particular weight of 2 people who shared an experience that couldn't be fully communicated to anyone who hadn't lived it. "I watched the council session," she said. The connection was clear. She was using the bureau-provided encrypted line, not her personal phone. "Trayvon Okafor, I remember his stop. I was the backup unit. Coulter handled the seizure. I watched him count the cash 3 times, and the amount on the receipt was $400 less than what I saw him pull from the glove box." "Did you document it?" "It's in the database, complaint number 8471, filed by Okafor 3 days after the stop, closed in 72 hours, finding vehicle stop conducted within department policy, seizure consistent with civil asset forfeiture guidelines." "And the $400? "Never appeared in any record, not the seizure log, not the evidence inventory, not the department's forfeiture account. $400 that existed for 20 seconds in Coulter's hands and then didn't exist anymore." The silence between them was the particular kind that existed between people who understood that some problems were too large for the tools they'd been given. Federal investigations could remove individuals. Consent decrees could mandate policy changes. But the space between policy and practice, the space where $400 disappeared and a complaint closed in 72 hours and a retired teacher stood at a microphone saying, "We've been telling you," that space persisted because it was built into the architecture of every institution that had ever been given authority over people it didn't trust. "Radford asked me to testify at the consent decree hearing," Morse said. "In person, not by video. Open session. That means your identity becomes public. It's already public. The conference room video leaked 3 weeks ago. Someone recorded the screen with a phone. My face is on 4 different news sites." "Are you safe?" Morse paused. The pause lasted long enough that Terrance could hear the ambient noise of wherever she was. Distant traffic, the hum of an air conditioner, the muted sounds of someone else's life happening in an adjacent room. "I'm alive. I have a job. I have a purpose. I'm not in that building anymore." Another pause. "Safe is relative. Safe is a neighborhood where nobody calls 911 because you're sitting on your own porch." The line went quiet. They both knew what that meant. Safe wasn't a condition. It was a privilege, distributed unevenly, enforced selectively, and withdrawn without notice or appeal. "I'll testify," Morse said. "Open session, full name, on the record, because documentation matters even when nobody's reading it. Eventually, someone reads it." She hung up. Terrance set the phone on his desk, looked at the case file. The physical file, the one he kept in a locked drawer rather than on the federal server, the one with the original notes he'd written during 3 weeks on Birchwood Lane and one night in a concrete cell. The file was thick, heavy, substantial in the way that only paper could be, carrying the weight of evidence in a form that couldn't be overwritten from a desktop terminal at 2:37 a.m. He closed the drawer, locked it. The key went on his keychain, next to his house key, and the key to the apartment's mailroom, and a small brass key that opened nothing anymore. The key to the front door of 4712 Birchwood Lane, which he'd kept not because he needed it, but because some evidence was personal, and personal evidence didn't belong on federal servers. It belonged in a pocket, close to the body, where you could feel its weight when you forgot why you carried it. The criminal cases moved at their own pace, slower than the public wanted, faster than the defense attorneys preferred, and exactly as slow as the federal court system was designed to operate. Fitch's case was the first to resolve. His attorney, a former federal prosecutor turned defense counsel recruited by the police union at significant expense, negotiated for 4 months before arriving at a plea agreement. Fitch would plead guilty to 1 count of deprivation of rights under color of law and 1 count of filing a false report. The remaining charges would be dropped. Sentencing guidelines suggested 18 to 24 months in federal custody, with the possibility of early release for cooperation. Fitch cooperated, not enthusiastically. His testimony was the particular blend of admission and deflection that characterized officers who understood they were going to prison and wanted to minimize the duration. But he provided 2 pieces of information that expanded the investigation beyond the original scope. First, he confirmed that Coulter had instructed him to embellish the arrest report, specifically to add the jacket and the furtive movements, during a phone call at 11:05 p.m., 30 minutes after Terrance was booked. Fitch had saved the call log. The call lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds, long enough to compose a narrative, long enough to constitute conspiracy. Second, he identified 3 additional officers who had participated in similar evidence fabrication schemes over the preceding 2 years, officers whose names had not appeared in Morse's documentation or in the FBI's existing case file. 2 of the 3 were still active duty. One had transferred to a department in a neighboring county, carrying his methods with him like a contagion. The additional officers were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Their cases would take months to develop. The transferred officer's new department initiated its own internal review, reluctantly, under pressure from the state attorney general's office, and with the particular half-heartedness of an institution conducting an investigation it hoped would find nothing. Coulter's case went to trial. His attorney, private counsel, not union-provided, funded by savings and a second mortgage, filed motions to suppress the body cam overwrite evidence, arguing that the terminal access logs were obtained without a warrant and that Coulter's Fourth Amendment rights were violated when the FBI accessed his work computer. The motion was denied. The judge, a federal district court judge named Helen Carruthers, appointed 12 years earlier, with a reputation for precision and an allergy to procedural games, ruled that the computer was department property accessed during an authorized federal investigation and that Coulter had no reasonable expectation of privacy in a device owned by his employer. The trial lasted 8 days. 12 witnesses, 400 exhibits. The prosecution presented the case in layers, starting with Terrance's arrest and working outward to the broader pattern of civil rights violations, using each layer to reinforce the one beneath it. The ring camera footage, the body cam overwrite log, the twin IA databases, the pill bottle, which forensic analysis traced to a batch of oxycodone seized during a traffic stop on I-40 18 months earlier, a seizure that Coulter had supervised, and for which the evidence inventory showed 23 pills recovered, while the lab had received only 17. 6 missing pills, one of which ended up in Terrance Calloway's property bag. The defense argued that Coulter was a dedicated officer targeted by a federal investigation that had predetermined its outcome, that the evidence was circumstantial, that the overwrite was a technical glitch, that the pill bottle could have been placed by anyone with access to the evidence room, that the investigation itself was biased, a federal agency building a case to justify its own existence. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. They returned guilty verdicts on 5 of 6 counts. The falsification of records charge, the only count requiring proof that Coulter knew his warrant affidavit contained false statements rather than merely reckless ones, was the lone acquittal, a distinction that mattered to lawyers and meant nothing to anyone else. Sentencing was scheduled for 3 months later. The guidelines suggested 48 to 60 months. Coulter's attorney filed for downward departure, citing years of service and the absence of prior convictions. The prosecution filed for upward departure, citing the systematic nature of the conduct and the number of victims affected. The judge split the difference. 51 months. Federal custody. No parole in the federal system. Just the possibility of good time credit reducing the sentence by approximately 15%. Coulter showed no visible reaction when the sentence was read. He stood straight, hands clasped in front of him, wearing the same sport coat he'd worn on the night he sat in Terrance's holding cell and tried to turn a fabricated pill bottle into a felony. The sport coat looked smaller now, or maybe he did. The particular compression that happened to people when the system they'd weaponized turned its weight back on them. Taggart's case settled before trial. His attorney negotiated a plea to misprision of felony, the weakest of the 3 charges, in exchange for a suspended sentence, 3 years of supervised probation, and permanent forfeiture of his law enforcement certification. No prison time. No federal record that would survive the expungement process his attorney would inevitably file after probation ended. The plea was criticized by community advocates who argued that the deputy chief's decision to extend Terrance's detention and authorize the search warrant, decisions made with knowledge of the fabricated evidence, warranted imprisonment, not probation. The U.S. Attorney's Office defended the plea as a pragmatic allocation of prosecutorial resources, noting that the evidence against Taggart was primarily testimonial rather than documentary, and that a trial would have been costly with an uncertain outcome. Pragmatic. The word prosecutors used when the system produced results that satisfied the law but not the community. Terrance followed the cases from his desk at the Raleigh field office, where he'd returned to full operational status 2 weeks after the arrest. His cover identity, Terrance the IT consultant, the quiet tenant of Birchwood Lane, was retired permanently. The house at 4712 was vacated, cleaned, and returned to Henderson Realty, which terminated its management contract with the owner and stopped returning calls from reporters. The Ring camera was removed. The footage, every frame from the first day of occupancy to the last, was preserved on the federal evidence server, tagged, cataloged, and indexed for retrieval during any future proceeding. Somewhere in that archive, filed between a motion for summary judgment and a sealed witness list, was a 37-second clip of a man sitting on a porch swing with a book and a cup of coffee, doing nothing illegal, looking at nothing suspicious, being nobody dangerous, until a flashlight beam and a pair of handcuffs turned him into evidence of everything that was wrong with the building where the flashlight was stored. On a Thursday evening in November, 8 months after the arrest, 4 months after the indictments, 2 weeks after Coulter's sentencing, Terrance drove back to Durham. Not to Colton Ridge, not to Holloway Road. He drove to a coffee shop on 9th Street, near the Duke campus, where Lena Ostrowski was waiting at a corner table with a laptop and a stack of files that hadn't gotten any smaller since the last time he'd seen her. She looked up when he entered. Didn't wave, just nodded, the acknowledgement of a person who'd shared a particular kind of experience and didn't need performative warmth to maintain the connection. He sat down, ordered coffee, waited for her to finish typing before speaking. "The consent decree draft is being circulated," he said. "DOJ is asking for 5 years of federal monitoring, independent compliance team, quarterly reporting on use of force statistics, complaint resolution timelines, and forfeiture program oversight." 5 years? Ostrowski set down her cup. "Rawlings will be long gone. The interim sheriff has the institutional memory of a goldfish, and the county commission is already complaining about the cost of compliance." "You sound pessimistic." "I sound experienced." She opened one of the folders. Inside, printouts of recent incident reports from the substation, post-arrest, post-indictment, post-reform announcement incident reports. Since the consent decree was announced, the department has logged 43 traffic stops in Colton Ridge and the surrounding neighborhoods. 39 of those stops involved Black or Latino motorists. The rate is actually higher than before the investigation. She slid the folder across the table. Reform was announced. Whether it's enforced is a different question. Terrance read the reports, scanned the demographics, checked the stop justifications, the boilerplate language of lane deviation, equipment violation, suspicious movement that served as the procedural wallpaper for encounters that began with observation and ended with assumption. "Faulkner," he said. The name from the staff meeting. The deputy who'd raised his hand and asked how long the feds had been watching. "He's writing most of these reports." Faulkner was Coulter's patrol partner for 3 years before Coulter moved to investigations. Ostrowski took the folder back. Different detective, same methods, same paperwork language, same outcomes. Has anyone filed a complaint? 2, both closed within 48 hours. Finding, unsubstantiated. The coffee grew cold between them. The shop filled with students and professors, and people who lived in a world where traffic stops were inconveniences rather than confrontations, where police encounters ended with warnings rather than handcuffs, where the system functioned with the quiet reliability of a machine that had been designed for their comfort. The IA database Morse pulled, Terrance said. The administrative version. How far back does it go? 7 years, 2,143 complaints. Of those, 68 resulted in sustained findings. 68 out of 2,143. That's a sustain rate of 3.2%. National average is around 8. Durham County is half the national average, and of those 68 sustained findings, the most severe discipline imposed was a 3-day suspension without pay, 3 days, for conduct that included 2 broken bones, a dislocated shoulder, and a ruptured eardrum. She closed the laptop. You built a good case, Agent Calloway. Coulter is in prison. Fitch is going to prison. Taggart lost his badge. The department is under a consent decree. By any metric, that's a win. But the culture that produced Coulter and Fitch and Taggart is still in that building. It's in the training protocols that teach de-escalation as a 45-minute elective and weapon retention as a 3-day course. It's in the union contract that requires 48 hours before an officer can be interviewed after a use of force incident. 48 hours to coordinate stories, consult lawyers, and align narratives. It's in the political structure that ties the sheriff's budget to arrest statistics and forfeiture revenue. She stood, gathered her files. You cut off the branches. The roots are still there. Terrance drove home that evening on I-40, passing the stretch of highway where Coulter's forfeiture operation had pulled over 37 motorists in 2 years and seized a combined $400,000 in cash and vehicles. The highway looked the same. The exits looked the same. The patrol cars stationed at intervals along the shoulder looked the same. Different officers, different badges, same positioning, same sight lines, same architecture of enforcement that selected its subjects by the same criteria it had always used. He thought about Morse. She was working for a nonprofit legal clinic in Charlotte now, doing intake interviews for people who'd been wrongfully arrested or subjected to excessive force. She'd told Terrance, during their last phone call, that the work was satisfying and exhausting in equal measure. Satisfying because she could help people navigate a system she understood intimately, exhausting because the stream of cases never slowed. For every Coulter who went to prison, there were 10 more who didn't. For every department under consent decree, there were 100 operating exactly the way they always had. The hard part isn't the investigation, she'd said. The hard part is knowing that the investigation changed the evidence, but not the math. He thought about Diana Prescott, still in her house on Birchwood Lane, still on the neighborhood Facebook group, though she posted less frequently now, still living her life in a subdivision where a black man had been arrested on his own porch because she'd decided his presence was suspicious and had picked up the phone. Her probation would end in 11 months. Her fine had been paid. Her record would show a no-contest plea to filing a false police report, a misdemeanor that would appear on background checks, but wouldn't prevent her from voting, driving, traveling, or exercising any of the rights that Terrance had been temporarily stripped of on the night she called 911. He thought about the porch, the swing, the book he'd been reading, a novel he'd chosen specifically because it was boring, because boring was cover, because a man reading a thriller on his own porch might look suspicious to someone who was predisposed to find him suspicious, but a man reading literary fiction looked harmless. He'd left the book on the porch when Fitch put him on the ground. He didn't know what had happened to it, whether it was still there, pages warped by 3 weeks of rain, whether Diana had retrieved it, whether it had blown into the yard and been collected by a landscaping crew that didn't know its history. Small details. Meaningless details. The kind that lodged in memory, not because they mattered, but because the mind needed somewhere to put the feelings that didn't have names. the residue of a night spent on a concrete bench, wondering whether your career was over, whether your informant was safe, whether the system you'd dedicated your life to enforcing could protect you when you were on the wrong side of the encounter. At home, his real home, a 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet complex near the Raleigh field office, Terrance set his keys on the counter, hung his jacket on the hook by the door, and checked his personal phone. 3 messages. One from Radford about a scheduling change. One from Morse, a photo of her office at the legal clinic with the caption, Day 47, and one from a number he didn't recognize. He opened the last message. A photograph. Low resolution, taken from a distance, slightly blurred, the kind of image produced by a phone camera at maximum zoom in poor lighting. It showed the front of a house, beige siding, small porch, a swing that needed oiling. 4712 Birchwood Lane. Below the photograph, a single line of text. We know who lives there now. Terrance stared at the message. Read it twice, then 3 times. The house was vacant. Henderson Realty had terminated the lease. Nobody lived there anymore. Nobody was supposed to live there. But the photograph was recent. The lawn was freshly mowed. The porch light was on, and in the lower right corner of the image, barely visible, a car was parked in the driveway. Not a gray Ford Taurus, not a federal vehicle, a dark-colored sedan with no front plate. The same silhouette as the vehicle that had parked on Birchwood Lane the night of the aborted dead drop, the night Morse reported surveillance and canceled the delivery. The vehicle Terrance had captured on his Ring camera in 2 frames, too dark for plate identification, too distant for a model confirmation. That vehicle had never been identified. The investigation had treated it as a loose end, an unresolved data point in a case file that had enough resolved data points to proceed without it. An unknown. A ghost in the timeline. But ghosts didn't send text messages. Terrance screenshot the message, forwarded it to Radford's encrypted line, set the phone on the counter, stood in his kitchen, in his apartment, in the life he'd returned to after 3 weeks of pretending to be someone else, and felt the particular unease of a man who had closed a case and discovered that the case wasn't closed. That the roots Ostrowski had described, the ones the investigation hadn't reached, were deeper than anyone had mapped. That somewhere in the network of corruption and complicity and institutional self-protection, someone was still watching. Not Coulter. Coulter was in a federal facility in Butner, North Carolina, serving 51 months. Not Fitch. Fitch was awaiting sentencing, GPS monitored, confined to his apartment. Not Taggart. Taggart was on probation, stripped of his certification, spending his days at a lake house in Kerr County that his wife's family owned. Someone else. Someone whose name wasn't in the case file. Someone who had known about the cover house, known about the dead drop. Known enough to position a vehicle on Birchwood Lane at the exact time the delivery was scheduled. Someone who was still inside the system. Terrance's phone buzzed. Radford's response. Received, tracing the number. Don't go back to Durham. He set the phone down, walked to the window, looked out at the parking lot, at the cars, at the ordinary evening landscape of a Raleigh apartment complex where people were coming home from work and walking dogs and living in a world that felt stable and predictable and safe. The consent decree would take 5 years to implement. The consent decree might change the policies. The policies might change the training. The training might change the behavior. Might. But the person who sent that photograph was not subject to consent decrees or policy changes or 5-year reform timelines. That person existed in the space between the system's stated values and its actual operations, the gap where corruption lived, where power protected itself, where the branches grew back after cutting because the roots had never been touched. Terrance closed the curtain. The case was not over. It had never been over. It had only paused long enough for everyone to believe it was, which was exactly when the dangerous part began. Outside, the sun was going down over Raleigh. In Durham, the Holloway Road substation was running its evening shift. Deputies filing reports, processing bookings, responding to calls, the machinery of law enforcement operating as it always had, under new oversight that might or might not survive the first budget cycle. And on Birchwood Lane, in a house that was supposed to be empty, a porch light burned. Someone had turned it on.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video today. If you found the content helpful, please remember to like and subscribe so you won't miss our upcoming episodes. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to leave a comment below. We are always here to listen.